Beneath the sun-bleached ruins of marble temples and forgotten sanctuaries lies a world far stranger than what history books would have us believe. Ancient Greece, the cradle of Western civilization, birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and myth, holds secrets that defy reason. Not just legends carved in stone or whispered by poets, but chilling anomalies. Sacred oracles who predicted the fall of empires with eerie precision, underground labyrinths whose purpose remains unknown, and inexplicable artifacts that suggest the Greeks may have touched something otherworldly. Why did entire city-states vanish without a trace? What truly happened at Eleusis during the mystery rites, where initiates swore lifelong silence? And how did ancient engineers craft machines so advanced they seem to mock our timeline of progress? These are not just tales of gods and monsters. These are riddles buried in time, traces of a civilization that may have known far more than we imagine. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the shadows of the Parthenon beyond the veil of myth and uncover the ancient Greece mysteries that will give you chills. Beneath the sunlit waters of the Aegean Sea, off the craggy coast of Antikythera, lies a shipwreck frozen in time. Discovered by sponge divers in 1901, its remnants rested over 150 feet below the surface, draped in coral and mystery. Among amphorae and statues of forgotten gods, buried in centuries of silt and salt, something else emerged, something wholly unexpected. A corroded lump of bronze and wood, fractured into fragments, unassuming at first glance, yet unlike anything ever seen from the ancient world. This was the Antikythera Mechanism. Today it rests in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, sealed behind glass, illuminated by soft lighting that cannot hide its jagged, time-worn contours. Yet through the rust and ruin, hints of gears with interlocking teeth, peek through, betraying a sophistication far beyond what the ancient Greeks were thought capable of. What was this object really? And more importantly, how? Scholars were baffled from the start. Initially mistaken for a navigational instrument or even an ancient clock, it wasn't until decades later, through X-ray imaging and digital reconstruction, that its full complexity began to unfold. The Antikythera Mechanism, it seemed, was an astronomical calculator, capable of tracking celestial cycles with astonishing accuracy. Constructed in the 2nd century BC, perhaps earlier, this device could predict eclipses, model the movements of the sun and moon, and even simulate the irregular orbit of the moon, something that required understanding of the subtle anomaly known today as the lunar anomaly, or the moon's variable speed along its elliptical path. That alone would be enough to place it centuries ahead of its time. But there's more, much more. Embedded within the mechanism are at least 30 meshing bronze gears. Some scholars believe there may have originally been over 70. They were hand-cut with exquisite precision, forming a mechanical logic that rivals the craftsmanship of Renaissance-era timepieces. Yet this machine predates them by over 1,400 years. What kind of mind could conceive such a thing in the ancient world? And how did this knowledge vanish so completely? The historical context offers some clues, but no certainties. By the 2nd century BC, the Greeks had developed a deep tradition of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. Thinkers like Archimedes and Hipparchus were unraveling the mathematical underpinnings of the cosmos. There are even references in ancient texts. Pliny the Elder mentions devices that model the heavens, and Cicero describes a machine built by Archimedes that mimicked the motions of the celestial bodies. Could the Antikythera Mechanism have been one of these? A product of a lost lineage of Greek mechanical genius? Possibly. But then, why is it the only one? No other device of comparable complexity has ever been found from the ancient world. Not in Egypt, not in Persia, not even in Rome. Nothing else comes close. Is it a singular creation? A stroke of genius that flickered briefly before vanishing into history? Or could it be a surviving fragment of a broader, forgotten scientific tradition? Modern scholars have managed to decipher much of the mechanism's function. Inscribed markings on the dials suggest it tracked the Metonic cycle, a 19-year lunar cycle used to predict eclipses. It may also have included the Saros cycle, a longer period used by Babylonian astronomers to forecast eclipses with surprising reliability. This cross-cultural knowledge hints at something deeper, an ancient fusion of Greek mechanical ingenuity with Babylonian astronomy. The device may have been used not only to chart the heavens, but to embed sacred cosmology into mechanical form, a moving, ticking vision of the divine order. But some theories go further still. There are whispers among fringe historians and speculative researchers who ask questions mainstream academia hesitates to entertain. Could the Antikythera Mechanism be evidence of forgotten contact with an older civilization? A relic not of Greece alone, but of knowledge preserved or inherited from even earlier cultures? Atlantis is inevitably mentioned. So is the possibility of a pre-cataclysmic seafaring civilization whose technological achievements were lost to time and tide. While there's no direct evidence for such claims, the mere existence of the mechanism keeps these questions alive. After all, if this level of craftsmanship could emerge once, what else might have been created and lost? Some suggest the mechanism is too advanced for its era, that it hints at an evolutionary jump in technology that doesn't align with what we understand of the ancient world. Others point to the potential symbolic or ritual significance of the device. Was it merely scientific or also spiritual? Did it serve priests as much as astronomers? Was it used in the temples of Apollo or Artemis to align rites with the heavens? And then there are the unanswered technical mysteries. We still don't know exactly how the Greeks manufactured gears so fine, or what tools they used to measure and cut them with such precision. The bronze alloys, the engravings, the internal structure, all suggest a workshop of extraordinary skill, possibly centered in Rhodes, where Hellenistic engineers flourished. But again, no similar devices have been found. No blueprints, no other fragments. Just this one, a marvel without a lineage. In the end, the Antikythera Mechanism forces us to reckon with a truth historians sometimes resist. The past is not as linear as we imagine. Knowledge can surge forward and vanish. Entire chapters of human ingenuity may be missing, lost in fire, flood, or silence. This small, broken machine, dredged from the deep, asks more questions than it answers. Who built it? Why? And how many other marvels lie hidden still, beneath the sea, beneath the soil, or beneath our own assumptions? We may never know. But one thing is certain: the Antikythera Mechanism should not exist. And yet, it does. And that changes everything. Just northwest of Athens, nestled among olive groves and quiet hills, lie the silent remains of Eleusis. To the untrained eye, they appear unremarkable. Crumbling foundations, scattered stone, the sun casting long shadows over ancient walkways. Yet in antiquity, this was one of the most sacred sites in all of Greece. For nearly 2,000 years, Eleusis drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean, not for gold, not for conquest, but for revelation. This was the heart of the Eleusinian Mysteries. From the 15th century BC until the rise of Christianity, the rites of Eleusis were celebrated in secrecy so complete, so fiercely protected, that not a single initiate ever revealed what they saw or experienced within the telesterion, the great hall of initiation. No written account survives. No whisper passed to outsiders. What was so powerful, so profound, that tens of thousands of initiates, over the course of centuries, remained silent until their deaths? The Eleusinian Mysteries were dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, goddesses of the harvest and the underworld. Their myth is well known. Persephone, the daughter, is abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Demeter, stricken by grief, withholds the fertility of the earth, plunging the world into barrenness. Eventually, a deal is struck. Persephone returns each spring, and life resumes. A story of death and rebirth, of descent, loss, and return. But at Eleusis, this myth was more than a tale. It was a path. Initiates walked it, both literally and symbolically. The process began in Athens, where the chosen participants, called Mystai, gathered and made a sacred procession to Eleusis along the sacred way, a road still partially visible today, its ancient stones worn by centuries of pilgrims' feet. Along the way, they bathed in the sea, performed rituals, and prepared themselves for what lay ahead. By the time they reached the Telesterion, they had shed their worldly identities. What occurred inside remains one of the greatest enigmas of the ancient world. We know a few things. The rituals were divided into the lesser and greater mysteries, with the greater held each year in September. They involved fasting, purification, chanting, dancing, and sacred drama. And at their core, something referred to only as the epopteia, the vision. The Roman writer Cicero, himself an initiate, called it something so holy and awe-inspiring that it transforms the life of those who partake in it. Others described it as a moment of intense revelation, a direct encounter with divine truth. But what was seen? What was revealed? This is where the mystery deepens. Some scholars suggest that a sacred object, perhaps an ear of grain or a glowing light, was unveiled, symbolizing the eternal cycle of life and death. Others believe the experience was more than symbolic, that it was visceral, psychedelic even. Here, history begins to blur at the edges. One increasingly discussed theory is that the initiates consumed a sacred potion called kykeon, a mixture of barley, mint, and water. On the surface, simple enough. But some researchers propose that the barley used in the kykeon may have been infected with ergot, a fungus containing alkaloids similar to LSD. If true, the initiates at Eleusis may have undergone a guided hallucinogenic journey, one carefully curated by priestly figures who had mastered its use over generations. A chemically induced death and rebirth experience held within ritual, myth, and sacred performance. Could this explain the lifelong silence? Not just secrecy, but reverence? Could Eleusis have offered an early, controlled form of psychedelic initiation, a religious technology millennia ahead of its time? There's no definitive evidence. The Telesterion was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, by Persians, Romans, and time itself. The sacred implements were likely hidden, burned, or lost. And yet, the theory persists, not because it is proven, but because it fits. Still, others resist this idea, suggesting instead that the power of the mysteries lay in psychological catharsis, an internal transformation facilitated by ritual drama and community. After all, participants included some of the greatest minds of the ancient world: Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, and even emperors. Were they simply deluded, or did they experience something real and utterly unexplainable? There are stranger theories still. A few fringe researchers have drawn parallels between the layout of Eleusis and certain astronomical alignments, suggesting that initiates may have been guided to contemplate the cosmos itself, not just as distant stars, but as divine machinery. Others speculate that the rituals preserved knowledge from a forgotten pre-Greek civilization, one steeped in sacred geometry, cycles of nature, and esoteric insight lost to time. While these ideas remain unverified, the fact that Eleusis persisted for so many centuries, with its rituals unchanged, its secrecy unbroken, demands attention. Something profound happened here. Something beyond politics, beyond myth. A continuity of experience, generation after generation, uniting peasant and philosopher alike in a single shared silence. Even as Christianity rose and temples fell, the final flicker of Eleusis was snuffed out not by disinterest, but by decree. In the late 4th century AD, the Christian emperor Theodosius banned all pagan rites. The telesterion was destroyed. The mysteries were over. And just like that, the doors closed forever. Today, you can walk the ruins. You can stand where the initiates once stood. The wind moves through the marble columns, and the stones beneath your feet seem to hum with memory. But the truth of what happened in the heart of Eleusis remains hidden. Was it divine revelation? Was it a ritualistic encounter with death and rebirth? Was it theater, chemistry, psychology, or something else entirely? The silence of the initiates echoes across millennia, not out of fear, but perhaps because the mystery was never meant to be spoken. And if it were revealed, would we even understand it? In the quiet ruins where Plato once walked, the marble is cracked, the columns fractured by time, but his words still echo, not just in philosophy or politics, but in myth. A myth that has captivated generations, inspired expeditions, and fueled endless speculation. Atlantis, not a word carved in stone or passed down in Homeric verse, but one that emerges suddenly, vividly, in the dialogues of a single man. Where did it come from? And more importantly, was it ever real? Plato first describes Atlantis in 2 of his later works, the Timaeus and the Critias. Written around 360 BC, these dialogues claim to recount a tale passed down from Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, who heard it from Egyptian priests during a visit to the temple at Sais some 150 years earlier. According to the story, Atlantis was a vast island empire located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, a land of extraordinary wealth, technological sophistication, and military power. Its kings descended from the god Poseidon. Its architecture gleamed with orichalcum, its temples soared skyward, and its canals were said to encircle the central city in perfect, concentric harmony. It was, by all accounts, a marvel of the ancient world. And then, it vanished. According to Plato, in a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. At first glance, the tale seems allegorical. Plato, the philosopher, using myth to illustrate a moral warning. Atlantis, in this reading, is a cautionary tale about hubris and the fall of civilizations. A society that had once been virtuous was corrupted by greed and conquest. The gods punished them accordingly. And yet, there are details in the account that go beyond allegory. Plato gives specific measurements, lengths of walls, widths of harbors, numbers of soldiers, types of metals. He describes the geography in precise terms. The city, he says, had a central acropolis surrounded by rings of land and water. He even includes the timeline. Atlantis flourished 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing its fall around 9,600 BC. This specificity has troubled and fascinated scholars for over 2 millennia. Was Plato recounting a distorted memory of a real place? An ancient echo passed down through cultures, eventually dressed in Greek language and myth? Or was it pure invention, crafted not from history, but imagination? The mainstream scholarly view is that Atlantis was never meant to be taken literally. Historians argue that Plato used the myth as a literary device, drawing on familiar elements of older myths, such as the destruction of the Minoans, or even echoes of the Trojan War. They point to the lack of any corroborating evidence from other ancient texts. No mention of Atlantis appears in Herodotus, Homer, or Hesiod. But the mystery has never faded, because time and again, history has surprised us. Entire civilizations once thought mythical, like Troy, have later been unearthed in stone and ash. And Plato's dating of Atlantis's fall, curiously, aligns with the end of the last ice age, a time of dramatic sea level rise, rapid climate shifts, and the sudden disappearance of coastal settlements across the globe. This coincidence has led some to look again, to dig deeper. One popular theory links Atlantis to the island of Santorini, ancient Thera, whose massive volcanic eruption around 1600 BC destroyed a flourishing Minoan settlement. Ash clouds blotted out the sun. Tidal waves swept across the Aegean. The civilization, advanced in plumbing, art, and urban planning, never fully recovered. Could Plato's Atlantis be a cultural memory of this catastrophe? The grandeur of Minoan Crete, filtered through centuries of storytelling? Others point westward, toward Spain's Dodona wetlands, where geological surveys have revealed traces of concentric structures buried beneath the mud. Some researchers claim these remnants could match Plato's descriptions. Still others look to the submerged land masses of the Azores, or ancient maps that depict islands now lost to the sea. And then there are the more speculative threads, theories that venture into uncharted waters. Some suggest Atlantis was a remnant of a pre-Ice Age civilization, one that thrived when vast parts of Earth were still land, not sea. Others propose connections to submerged ruins in the Caribbean or off the coasts of India and Japan, places where underwater structures hint at human habitation long before recorded history. A few even posit that the tale holds not just a memory of a sunken land, but of advanced knowledge. Astronomy, geometry, perhaps even a forgotten technology, preserved briefly before disappearing beneath the waves. Still, the evidence remains elusive. No definitive ruins, no inscriptions bearing the name, no maps labeling its place. And yet, something about Atlantis endures. Perhaps it is not the promise of treasure or lost power, but the unspoken suggestion that we have only scratched the surface of human history. That between myth and memory, there lies a space where truth once stood, and where it might still wait to be found. Standing among the ancient columns of Plato's Academy, it's easy to imagine the philosopher's students listening with wide eyes as he spoke of a world lost, a world more advanced, more beautiful, more tragic than their own. A world that once was. But if Atlantis did exist, where is it now? High in the rugged heart of central Greece, where Mount Parnassus towers over the ancient valley of Phaistos, lie the ruins of Delphi. Jagged cliffs rise around it like natural ramparts, and the air carries a strange silence, as if the stones themselves are listening. Once considered the center of the world by the ancient Greeks, Delphi was more than a sanctuary. It was the navel of divine truth, the axis between mortals and the gods, and at its heart sat a woman, shrouded in mystery. The Oracle of Delphi, known as the Pythia. From as early as the 8th century BC, kings, generals, and commoners alike made the long pilgrimage to Delphi to ask her their most desperate questions. Should we go to war? Can the harvest be saved? Will the gods favor this marriage, this voyage, this child? In response, the Pythia would descend into a trance. Seated on a tripod above a sacred chasm in the temple of Apollo, she would speak words that, though often cryptic, were believed to carry the voice of the god himself. But what was this trance? What truly happened inside that temple, behind its veils of incense and ritual? And perhaps more importantly, where did the voice come from? Ancient accounts describe the Pythia's condition in striking detail. She would enter the Adyton, the inner chamber of the temple, purify herself with spring water, chew laurel leaves, and inhale sacred vapors rising from the earth. Soon after, her voice would change. Her body would tremble. She would speak in ecstatic utterances, her eyes wide, her body swaying, her words transcribed by priests who interpreted them for the petitioners waiting outside. To those who witnessed it, there was no question. This was divine possession. For centuries, the oracle was believed to be the mouthpiece of Apollo himself. But the modern mind asks other questions. Could the trance have been induced by natural forces? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many scholars began to dismiss the stories of vapors as poetic invention, symbols rather than phenomena. It was assumed that the descriptions of the oracle's ecstatic states were exaggerations or theatrical elements of an elaborate religious performance. But in 2001, that changed. A team of geologists, archaeologists, and toxicologists revisited Delphi. Not just the mythology, but the geology beneath it. What they discovered brought new life to an ancient claim. The Temple of Apollo, it turns out, sits directly atop the intersection of two major fault lines. From these faults, the researchers found evidence that hydrocarbon gases, most notably ethylene, could have seeped up from the earth through fissures in the rock. Ethylene, in small concentrations, is known to produce euphoria, disorientation, and in some cases, hallucinations. Suddenly, the ancient stories of the sacred chasm and intoxicating vapors didn't seem so far-fetched. Could the Pythia have truly entered her trance not through performance or invention, but through exposure to mind-altering gases from deep within the earth? This theory, though compelling, raises new questions. Why did only the Pythia experience such powerful effects? Was she trained to interpret the sensations? Or was she chosen because of a natural sensitivity, perhaps even a neurological predisposition to altered states? Some researchers speculate that the trance may have involved a combination of factors. The gases, yes, but also ritual fasting, rhythmic chanting, and the intense psychological pressure of speaking for a god. Others believe that substances may have been used intentionally. Laurel leaves, for example, long associated with Apollo, contain chemical compounds that could contribute to mild psychoactive effects. The kykeon, a ceremonial drink used in other Greek rites, has also been linked to altered consciousness. Could the Pythia have consumed something similar? Still, there's another layer, one that edges into the spiritual. Many ancient sources describe the oracle's voice not just as altered, but inhuman, as if something else were speaking through her. Were the gases merely a trigger, or a gateway? Was the Pythia channeling a divine force as her worshippers believed? Or tapping into something psychological, even biological, that we still do not fully understand? Fringe theorists have gone further. Some suggest that Delphi was built precisely because of the geological anomaly, that ancient Greeks may have sensed the energy of the site in ways we can no longer measure. Others posit that the Pythia's trance was a form of shamanic journeying, linking her to other oracular traditions across the ancient world, from the priestesses of Anatolia to the seers of ancient Palestine. There are even comparisons drawn to certain altered states described in modern near-death experiences and deep meditation, suggesting that the oracle's vision may have been less about external gases and more about a finely tuned internal threshold reached only through years of training and ritual discipline. And yet, despite decades of study, we still do not fully understand how it all worked. The temple is silent now. The sacred spring still flows, and the wind still moves through the stones. But the voice of Apollo is gone. The oracle no longer speaks, and we are left with fragments of stone, of memory, of mystery. Did the gods truly speak through the Pythia? Or did she, in those altered states, tap into something within the human mind that we have yet to comprehend? We may never know. But as we stand at the foot of Mount Parnassus, gazing out across the sacred valley, a deeper question lingers in the silence. What did she see? In the moments before the voice spoke, it measures just under 6 inches in diameter, modest in size, humble in appearance, made of baked clay, reddish-brown and slightly warped by time. But the symbols impressed upon its surface, 241 in total, have stirred questions no one has been able to answer. This is the Phaistos Disc. Discovered in 1908 in the ruins of the Minoan Palace at Phaistos on the southern coast of Crete, it remains one of the most baffling artifacts from the ancient world. A riddle cast in clay. What was it? Who made it? And perhaps most haunting of all, what does it say? The disc was found buried in a basement room, alongside shards of pottery from the 2nd millennium BC, roughly dated to around 1700 BC. That places it squarely in the heart of the Minoan civilization, a culture already shrouded in mystery. But the Phaistos Disc stands apart, even from its enigmatic context. Unlike Linear A, the still undeciphered script used by the Minoans, the symbols on the disc are unique. They are not incised or written, but stamped, pressed into the soft clay with small, reusable seals. This makes the Phaistos Disc the earliest known example of movable type printing, a concept that wouldn't reappear in human history until the invention of the Gutenberg press over 3,000 years later. Was this intentional? Was the disc a test, a prototype, or part of a now-lost system of mass communication? Or was it a singular artifact, ritual, symbolic, never meant to be copied? The disc is inscribed on both sides, each spiral containing lines of mysterious pictographs. Human figures, birds, fish, tools, flowers, even abstract shapes. Some repeat, some appear only once. Each one is exquisitely stamped, deliberate, not improvised. Attempts to decode the symbols have consumed scholars and amateurs alike for over a century. Some see in the pictographs a syllabic script, perhaps related to the linear A or B systems. Others suggest a logographic system, where each symbol represents a concept or word. A few even posit that the symbols are decorative, not linguistic, meant to invoke ideas or feelings, not literal messages. And yet, certain patterns emerge. There is structure. There is repetition. It feels like language. But a language of what kind? Mainstream scholars generally accept that the disc originates from Minoan Crete and is written in a now-lost language. If this is true, then the disc is likely a religious or ceremonial object, perhaps a hymn, a prayer, a chant encoded in a script reserved for sacred use. Others think it might be a game board, a calendrical tool, or a mnemonic device, its spiral design guiding the reader through stages of initiation or ritual memory. But there are alternate theories, some conventional, others more speculative. One suggestion is that the disc did not originate in Crete at all, but was imported from Anatolia, the Levant, or even further east. The writing system does not match known scripts of the Minoans or their neighbors. Could it belong to an entirely separate, now forgotten culture? A few researchers have pointed to similarities between some of the symbols and those found in early scripts of the Indus Valley or ancient Palestine. These connections are tenuous at best, but they raise a deeper question. Could the Phaistos Disc represent a fragment of a broader trans-Mediterranean network of ideas? A whisper from a civilization that has otherwise vanished without a trace? In more speculative circles, the theories grow even stranger. Some believe the disc holds encoded astronomical knowledge, cycles of the moon, solstices, eclipses, hidden within the spiral. Others suggest it is a magical charm used for healing, protection, or divination. There is even a proposal that the spiral design represents a journey, not just physical, but spiritual, a symbolic path of rebirth or transcendence. And then there are the fringe theories. A few have claimed that the disc is evidence of an advanced prehistoric civilization, technologically ahead of its time. That its printed symbols and perfect spirals hint at a kind of knowledge lost in the upheavals of ancient cataclysms, perhaps even tied to the Atlantis tradition passed down by Plato. Another controversial theory suggests that the disc was not meant to be read at all, but sung, that each symbol represents a phonetic sound, and the entire sequence forms a sacred melody, long forgotten, but once used in chants to commune with the divine. None of these theories can be confirmed, and yet none can be definitively ruled out. Despite the efforts of linguists, cryptographers, and historians, the disc resists translation. Without additional examples of the same script, without a Rosetta Stone, its meaning remains opaque. We have only one. No duplicates, no inscriptions on stone, no copies in other cities. Just this single, fragile artifact, and its silence. Some scholars believe this very uniqueness is a clue, that the disc was made for one person, one moment, one purpose, perhaps buried as part of a rite, perhaps never meant to be found. And yet, it was. Standing before the disc today, encased in glass, we are confronted not by an object, but by a question. One shaped like a spiral, winding inward, to a center we cannot see. Was the Phaistos Disc a hymn to a forgotten god? A message to the dead? A record of prophecy? Or was it simply art, a sacred object whose beauty transcended language? We don't know. And until another is found, or the key to its language unearthed, we may never know. But perhaps that is part of its power. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only contemplated. For thousands of years, a single name has echoed through the corridors of Western civilization: Homer, the father of epic poetry, the voice of the Iliad and the Odyssey, a bard who, through words alone, forged the foundation of Greek identity and myth. But who was Homer? A poet? Or a legend? A man? Or many? The identity of Homer remains one of the oldest and most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. A mystery not buried beneath earth and stone, but encoded in language, authorship, and memory. The Iliad and the Odyssey, two of the greatest epics ever composed, emerged from the mists of pre-classical Greece. The stories they tell are rich in detail, deep in emotion, and dazzling in their structure. They speak of war and homecoming, of wrath and redemption, of gods who intervene and mortals who endure. They also suggest a depth of cultural memory that reaches back centuries, perhaps even to the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. Yet, the texts themselves likely took their written form around the 8th century BC, during Greece's Archaic period. That's a span of some 400 years between the events they describe and the earliest plausible date of their composition. If Homer existed, he lived in this ambiguous era, a time of oral storytelling before widespread literacy, when poets wandered from city to city, reciting verses to the rhythm of the lyre. But here lies the question: was Homer one of these wandering poets, or was he something else entirely? Ancient sources tell us little that can be confirmed. Herodotus places Homer around 850 BC. Other traditions offer conflicting dates and different birthplaces: Smyrna, Chios, Ionia, even Thebes. More than 7 cities claimed to be his home, each competing for a share of his legacy. Some say he was blind, like the legendary poet Demodocus, who appears in the Odyssey itself. Others insist Homer never lived at all, that he was a convenient name attached to anonymous traditions, the face of a collective memory. The truth remains elusive. Was Homer a historical individual who composed both epics from memory, shaping oral traditions into enduring masterpieces? Or was Homer a title, like a guild name, passed down among generations of bards? Philologists have long debated the so-called Homeric question. They point to inconsistencies in style, vocabulary, and even theology between the Iliad and the Odyssey. Some suggest that the two works are the product of different authors, perhaps composed decades apart. Others believe that both were born of a long oral tradition, gradually evolving through performance, with Homer merely the final redactor, or a figure added retroactively. The formulaic structure of the verses, the use of repeated epithets like swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn, hints at oral composition. These phrases served as memory aids, allowing poets to improvise vast sections while maintaining rhythm and meter. Could Homer have been a master of this oral tradition, dictating his works at the cusp of Greece's transition to writing? Or are we reading too much into a name, projecting a single author onto what was, in truth, a sprawling cultural tapestry? The advent of alphabetic writing in Greece, around the 8th century BC, adds another layer to the mystery. Some scholars propose that the Iliad and Odyssey were the very first works to be written in this new script, a script possibly adapted from Phoenician sources. If so, their preservation would represent not just literary genius, but a technological turning point. Others, however, argue that writing came later, that the epics continued to evolve orally, possibly for generations, before being inscribed. If this is true, then even if Homer did exist, the texts we have today may differ substantially from what he once spoke. There's also the question of intentionality. Were these poems ever meant to be authored in the modern sense? Or were they communal property, living, changing performances that belonged to the people, shaped and reshaped by the collective voice? In the 20th century, the Homeric question took a new turn. Field research among Balkan oral poets by scholars like Milman Parry and Albert Lord revealed that traditional singers could compose hours of verse, entire epics, on the spot, drawing from a stock of formulas and episodes. The parallels to Homer were striking. Their work suggested that the Iliad and Odyssey could indeed have been composed orally, perhaps by a gifted individual, or several, across time. And yet, even this doesn't solve the puzzle of identity. If Homer was a product of oral tradition, how did such structured, thematically rich, and symbolically layered narratives arise? Could improvisation alone produce such literary depth? Or is there something more, something we've yet to understand, about how memory, performance, and genius converged in that moment of cultural emergence? In recent years, digital analysis and stylometric studies have attempted to dissect the epics with algorithms, comparing syntax, frequency, and linguistic patterns. Some findings suggest a single authorial hand. Others indicate multiple contributors. The data, like the tradition, remains ambiguous. There are also whispers in fringe circles, alternative theories that venture further from the accepted path. Some claim that Homer was a woman, perhaps a priestess with access to temple archives and oral lineages. Others believe that the name was a cipher, a mask concealing an elite scribal collective tied to early Greek sanctuaries. A few even suggest that the Homeric epics encode astronomical or esoteric knowledge layered in myth and metaphor, a kind of archaic science preserved in poetry. While such ideas often lack concrete evidence, they reflect the enduring mystery of Homer's voice. It is a voice that speaks across time, but whose source remains hidden. Today, in libraries and lecture halls, on the shelves of scholars and the lips of schoolchildren, Homer still lives. But behind the grandeur of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the figure remains in shadow, half seen, half heard. Was he a man? A myth? A mosaic of many voices? Or is Homer, like the stories he told, a mirror, reflecting not one identity, but a culture's yearning for permanence, for memory, for meaning? And if we could find him, would we understand him any better? In the heart of ancient Babylon, where the Euphrates once shimmered in the desert sun, a palace once stood, vast, ornate, and heavy with the scent of oil lamps, sandalwood, and wine. It was here, in the early summer of 323 BC, that the most powerful man in the known world was brought low. Alexander of Macedon, conqueror of Persia, pharaoh of Egypt, king of Asia. At just 32 years old, Alexander the Great had forged an empire that stretched from the shores of Greece to the edge of India. He had outwitted kings, broken armies, and rewritten the map of the ancient world. And then, suddenly, inexplicably, he died. But how? And why? The official version begins on June 10, 323 BC. Alexander, having returned to Babylon from his eastern campaigns, was preparing a new invasion. This time, a grand maritime expedition into Arabia. He had begun organizing fleets, planning temples, and issuing commands. But then, during a banquet with close friends and officers, he developed a fever. Over the next 10 to 12 days, his condition worsened. He grew weak, unable to speak. On the final day, he could no longer lift his head. According to some sources, his body showed no signs of decomposition for several days after death, a detail that would later feed countless legends. The physicians of his court were baffled. None could diagnose what had felled a man who seemed invincible only days before. Even today, over 2 millennia later, no definitive cause of death has been established. Was it natural illness? Some historians point to malaria, endemic in the swamps around Babylon. Others suggest typhoid fever, known to cause similar lingering symptoms. A few posit West Nile virus or acute pancreatitis. And yet, the gradual progression of his symptoms doesn't quite fit. Alexander remained lucid for most of his decline. He issued orders. He made decisions. There was no evidence of the delirium or intestinal distress common to such diseases. Could it have been a complication from a past wound? He had suffered many: a shattered femur, an arrow to the chest, a deep gash to the thigh. Any could have left lingering effects. One theory proposes a delayed reaction to a prior infection or internal injury, slowly spreading until it overwhelmed him. But then again, Alexander was no ordinary patient. His life had been shaped by omens, visions, and prophecy. His followers believed him divine, or at least touched by divinity. And that belief has invited darker theories. Could Alexander have been poisoned? It's a theory that dates back to antiquity, whispered in the courts of his successors. According to the Alexander Romance, a collection of semi-mythical biographies, the poison was administered in wine or possibly dissolved in water from the river Styx, a deadly toxin said to kill slowly without immediate symptoms. But poison presents a logistical problem. Most known ancient poisons act too quickly. Alexander's decline lasted nearly 2 weeks. That points away from the use of hemlock, arsenic, or deadly nightshade, substances known in the ancient world. Still, there are more obscure poisons. Certain plant-based toxins like aconite can kill gradually. Some suggest a mixture engineered to delay symptoms. Was there someone in his inner circle with both the motive and the knowledge? And if so, who? The political atmosphere was tense. Alexander had no clear successor. His only legitimate heir, his wife Roxana's unborn son, would not be born for months. His generals, the Diadochi, were ambitious and divided. Some accounts name Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, as a possible suspect. Others point to his son Cassander, who would later murder Alexander's wife and child. Even Ptolemy, Alexander's trusted companion and later ruler of Egypt, has been implicated in fringe accounts. Yet no solid evidence ever emerged. And the men who had the most to gain from Alexander's death were also those who remained closest to his memory, founding dynasties, writing histories, and waging wars in his name. Would they have risked his wrath, even posthumously? Or did they merely seize the opportunity once fate had done the work? Another layer of the mystery lies in what happened after Alexander died. His body was reportedly placed in a golden sarcophagus and preserved in honey, an ancient method of embalming. It was then transported toward Macedonia, but hijacked en route by Ptolemy, who brought it to Egypt. There, it vanished into history. For centuries, the tomb of Alexander was a place of pilgrimage, visited by Julius Caesar, Augustus, and other Roman emperors. But by the 4th century AD, its location was lost. To this day, despite numerous excavations, it has never been found. Could the secrets of his death lie with his remains? Some have suggested that his symptoms mirror a neurological disorder, such as Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can cause paralysis while sparing the mind. This might explain reports that Alexander remained mentally alert but physically immobilized. But others look beyond the medical. They ask, was Alexander's death foretold? Ancient sources tell of ill omens. A man seated on the royal throne uninvited. A dire sign. Strange weather. Sacred animals behaving erratically. A Babylonian astrologer warning Alexander not to enter the city at all. And Alexander himself, once obsessed with destiny and the gods, seemed uneasy. Was his death the result of ambition unchecked? A divine punishment for hubris? A self-fulfilling prophecy brought on by years of mythic expectation? In the end, we are left with silence. The silence of the palace room in Babylon, once filled with generals and priests, now crumbled into dust. The silence of a golden coffin, lost to time. The silence of history, when it guards its deepest secrets too well. Alexander the Great conquered the known world, but not his own fate. And as we peer back through the haze of centuries, we must ask, did the greatest leader of the ancient world fall to chance, to betrayal, or to something else entirely? What really happened in Babylon? And might the truth still lie buried, waiting quietly beneath centuries of shifting sand and forgotten memory? Where sea meets land and myth meets memory, the ghost of a forgotten city stirs. Few places in the Greek world carry the spectral weight of Helike. Once a prosperous city-state in the region of Achaia, Helike was said to rival the greatest polis of the ancient world. It minted its own coins, traded with foreign kingdoms, and erected a magnificent temple to Poseidon, the god who ruled the sea and, some believed, the very earth beneath their feet. But then, in a single night, it vanished. No war, no gradual decline. Only a sudden, violent end. The year was 373 BC, and Helike, the jewel of the northern Peloponnese, was gone. The story begins with trembling. According to ancient sources, the earth beneath Helike began to shake. Then came a thunderous roar, followed by a colossal earthquake. Buildings crumbled, statues toppled. The people, roused from their sleep, fled in panic. But the worst was yet to come. Almost immediately after the quake, a towering wave, the kind we would now call a tsunami, swept across the plain. The sea surged inland, swallowing fields, homes, and temples. Helike disappeared beneath the water, its citizens carried into oblivion. In the morning, there was nothing. No smoke, no cries, no ruins, only sea. The disaster was so complete, so shocking, that it left echoes in the ancient world for centuries. Writers like Strabo, Pausanias, and Diodorus Siculus recorded its fate. Travelers were told that for years after the catastrophe, fishermen would snag pieces of buildings or bronze statues in their nets. Some claimed that the tops of submerged columns could still be seen beneath the waves on calm days. To many, the destruction of Helike was divine punishment. The city had been sacred to Poseidon. Some whispered that the citizens had desecrated his temple or denied supplicants from a neighboring city. The earthquake, the tsunami, they were not just natural disasters, but the wrath of an offended god. Yet, as the centuries passed, Helike faded from maps and memory. By the time of the Roman Empire, its exact location was uncertain. By the Middle Ages, it was forgotten entirely. A Greek Atlantis. But was Helike ever real? For a long time, scholars debated whether the accounts were exaggerated or perhaps fictional altogether. Some assumed the story was simply a cautionary myth, a way to instill reverence for the sea god, or to explain natural disasters in an age before seismology. Others wondered, could Helike and Atlantis have been the same place? After all, Plato wrote his famous dialogues, the Timaeus and Critias, just a generation after Helike's destruction, and the parallels are uncanny. A wealthy, advanced society sunk beneath the sea in a single night. Did Plato take inspiration from a real event, transforming Helike into the more elaborate, idealized Atlantis? Or was the tale of Atlantis already circulating in oral traditions, and Helike simply another tragic echo of an older archetype? In the 19th and 20th centuries, many archaeologists attempted to locate Helike. They searched the coastal plains of Achaia. They scoured riverbeds and scanned offshore areas. But the sea, it seemed, kept its secrets. Then, in the 1990s, the landscape began to speak. A Greek archaeologist named Dora Katsinopoulou, working alongside Stephen Soter of the American Museum of Natural History, made a groundbreaking discovery just a few kilometers inland from the Gulf of Corinth. Not in the sea, as expected, but buried in the earth. There, beneath layers of sediment, they found ruins, walls, roads, pottery, dating to the classical era, inscriptions, coins bearing the symbol of Helike, a wave-patterned design and the image of Poseidon's trident. It seemed impossible. For centuries, people had assumed Helike was underwater. But here it was, entombed beneath the very delta it once overlooked. How could a city vanish into the sea, only to be buried on land? The answer may lie in geology. The Helike Plain sits along an active fault line. During the earthquake of 373 BC, the land itself likely dropped, creating a temporary lagoon that submerged the city. Over time, rivers carried sediment from the mountains, gradually covering the ruins with earth and pushing the coastline outward. Helike had not sunk into deep ocean like Atlantis. It had been swallowed by the land itself. Still, even with this compelling explanation, many questions remain. Why were the signs of its location hidden for so long? Why did no major effort succeed before the late 20th century? And more intriguingly, what else might still lie buried beneath the Helike Plain? The archaeological site is still being explored. Structures from both the classical and Hellenistic periods have been uncovered, including remnants of what may be the famous Temple of Poseidon. Streets have been mapped. Domestic buildings have yielded everyday objects, cups, tools, votive figurines. But there is something eerie about walking those ruins, knowing that, in one terrible moment, life here ended, that beneath one's feet may lie entire layers of civilization, undisturbed for over 2,000 years. Could there be a deeper layer still? A Mycenaean Helike, as some suggest, with ties stretching back to the Bronze Age? And might this be one reason why the memory of Helike lingered so powerfully in myth? Even now, the name Helike stirs something deep in the imagination. It is not merely the story of a city lost and found. It is a window into how the ancients experienced the fragility of existence. A reminder that power, piety, and prosperity offer no guarantee against the forces of the earth. It invites us to reflect on what has been buried, not just by water and soil, but by time, and to wonder how many more cities lie beneath our feet, forgotten by history, waiting in silence for the earth to tremble once more. Beneath the stones of Knossos, beneath the myth of the Minotaur and the echoing footsteps of Theseus, there lies a silence. A silence not of forgetting, but of the unknown. It is the silence of a script that has never spoken. Linear A. More than 3,500 years ago, before classical Greece, before Athens and Sparta, before the columns of the Parthenon rose to touch the sky, the Minoan civilization flourished on Crete. They built palatial centers, engaged in far-reaching trade, and adorned their walls with vivid depictions of bulls, dolphins, and ceremonies whose meanings remain elusive. But of all the mysteries the Minoans left behind, their religion, their politics, their possible ties to Atlantis, none is as haunting or as stubbornly undeciphered as their written language. Linear A. First discovered at the turn of the 20th century by Sir Arthur Evans during his excavations at Knossos, Linear A quickly distinguished itself from any known script. It bore some resemblance to another Minoan script known as Linear B, used later by the Mycenaeans. And yet, efforts to decode Linear A using the same methods that cracked Linear B have ended in frustration. Linear B, as it turned out, recorded an early form of Greek. Linear A does not. What do these graceful lines and abstract symbols record? On clay tablets and religious artifacts, we see lists, inventory tallies, and perhaps offerings. But beyond context, the actual content, the phonetics, the language underneath, remains obscure. More than 1,400 inscriptions in Linear A have been found, mostly on Crete, but also on neighboring islands and coastal points of the Aegean. Some are short, a few signs on a libation vessel. Others are longer, full tablets possibly tied to religious, administrative, or even poetic use. But decoding a script isn't just about having symbols. It's about knowing the language they stand for. And here lies the challenge. We don't know what language the Minoans spoke. Was it a language isolate, unrelated to anything we know today? Or was it linked to a known but forgotten linguistic family? Some scholars suggest it may be pre-Indo-European. Others have floated connections to ancient Anatolian languages. A few point toward Cypriot or even Semitic roots. But none of these theories has gained consensus. So we are left with signs without sound, words without voice. What makes Linear A even more enigmatic is its context. The Minoans were not an isolated people. Their civilization interacted with Egypt, the Levant, and the broader Mediterranean. Their art shows foreign influence. Their trade networks stretched wide. So how could such a sophisticated, outward-facing culture leave behind a script that no one else used, that no one else adopted, and that ultimately disappeared? Did the Minoan language die with the eruption of Thera and the decline of their palatial centers? Or was it absorbed, silently, invisibly, into the speech of the Mycenaeans, its words forgotten, but its echo preserved in myth? Even the transition to Linear B raises questions. Linear B borrowed many of its signs from Linear A, but used them to represent Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that Mycenaean scribes may have adapted an existing script to their own tongue. But if they were in contact with the Minoans, if they lived among them, conquered them, inherited their systems, why did they never preserve the meanings of the original language? Was it deliberate? In recent decades, researchers have turned to technology, statistical analyses of Linear A signs, comparative studies of sign frequency, AI models trained to spot patterns across known and unknown scripts. All have yielded insights, but no answers. One of the most compelling efforts involves comparing Linear A vocabulary with possible Semitic roots, especially from ancient tongues like Ugaritic or early Canaanite. Some scholars argue that certain phrases on ritual vessels bear striking resemblance to Semitic blessings or offerings. But without a bilingual key, like the famed Rosetta Stone for Egyptian hieroglyphs, there is no way to confirm such links. We are decoding shadows. There are also the more speculative theories. Some have suggested that Linear A was not a script for a spoken language at all, but a ceremonial or esoteric code, used only by priesthoods, perhaps never intended for the general population. Others have tied it to mythical or lost civilizations, from Lemuria to Atlantean constructs. And there are those who question whether we're even approaching the script from the right direction. Might the signs represent syllables or whole words? Is the structure phonetic or ideographic? Could we be imposing modern assumptions on an ancient logic? There is even the possibility that Linear A is part of a family of scripts that includes other undeciphered systems from the ancient Mediterranean, like the Cypro-Minoan script of Cyprus, or the mysterious signs found in the Cyclades and parts of Anatolia. Could there be a whole network of forgotten languages, connected by trade and ritual, erased by time and conquest? The physical remnants continue to emerge. In caves once used for sacred rites, fragments bearing Linear A have been uncovered. On votive cups, stone altars, and walls darkened by centuries of torchlight. In palace ruins, tablets show clear evidence of accounting. Grain tallies, livestock inventories, suggesting that this was not merely a religious script, but one embedded in the practical governance of Minoan life. And still, none of it speaks to us. Not yet. We can read the names of pharaohs. We can chant the hymns of Sumer. We can decipher the taxes of Babylon. But the voices of the Minoans, those who danced in bright robes beneath the horns of consecration, who sent offerings to gods unknown, who watched the sea from the heights of Phaistos and Zakros, those voices are still silent. The mystery of Linear A endures not just because of its symbols, but because of what it represents. An entire worldview, a culture's inner thoughts and sacred songs locked behind a wall of forgotten language. And we are left to ask, will we ever hear them speak again? Or is Linear A the boundary between what history remembers and what it chooses to forget? In the heart of a forgotten archive, or perhaps buried beneath layers of dust in an unexamined shelf of some monastery, a voice may be waiting. A voice from over 2 millennia ago, the voice of Aristotle. And not the Aristotle we think we know, but the Aristotle whose words, ideas, and questions have been lost to time. The name Aristotle conjures the weight of centuries. Student of Plato, tutor to Alexander the Great, a thinker whose influence ripples through nearly every field of human thought: logic, biology, ethics, metaphysics, politics. His surviving works shaped the foundation of Western philosophy and science. But what if what we have is only the shadow of what once existed? Of the estimated 200 to 300 works Aristotle is believed to have written, only about 30 survive in any complete form. Most of what we possess are lecture notes, compiled by his students, dense, technical, and meant not for publication, but for internal study at his school, the Lyceum. Gone are the dialogues. Gone are the polished philosophical treatises, works that, in the words of ancient authors, rivaled Plato in elegance and clarity. What happened to the rest? In the years following Aristotle's death in 322 BC, his writings passed into the hands of his successor, Theophrastus. Then, through a curious sequence of events, they disappeared. According to ancient accounts, particularly that of Strabo, the geographer, Aristotle's original works were eventually hidden in a cellar in Asia Minor, in the city of Skepsis. There, they were allegedly kept in secrecy for over a century, protected from the political purges of Macedonian rulers and the intellectual rivalries of competing schools. But protection came at a cost. Moisture, neglect, insects, decay. When these scrolls were finally unearthed, they were in poor condition, mildewed, fragmented, difficult to decipher. From there, they were supposedly taken to Athens and later to Rome, where the grammarian Andronicus of Rhodes attempted to reconstruct what he could. His additions would become the backbone of the Aristotelian corpus we know today. But this version, this patched partial survival, suggests a tantalizing absence. A library, once complete, now reduced to remnants. What were the lost works? We know some of their titles: On the Good, On Ideas, The Gryllus, Eudemus, A Dialogue on the Soul, On Philosophy in 3 books, A Homeric Problem Study, treatises on justice, education, rhetoric beyond what survives, and over 170 political constitutions, of which only the Athenian constitution remains. These were not the terse, logical texts of his notebooks. They were literary. They were philosophical. They were meant to be read, not just studied. And according to ancient commentators, they were brilliant. Cicero, the Roman orator and philosopher, lamented that the Aristotle he knew through these polished writings was far superior to the terse technical manuals that would survive. He spoke of Aristotle's prose as a river of gold, now lost. Why then were they allowed to vanish? Some suggest negligence, the vicissitudes of time, fire, war, forgetfulness. Others believe more deliberate forces may have played a role. One theory posits that rival philosophical schools, Stoics, Epicureans, or later Neoplatonists, may have worked to suppress or replace Aristotelian thought during periods of intellectual dominance, not through conspiracy, but through omission. Manuscripts not copied fall into silence, or perhaps it was religious filtering. When early Christian scholars in late antiquity preserved some texts and ignored others that contradicted theological frameworks. There is also the troubling matter of political relevance. Aristotle's Politics explores monarchy, democracy, and tyranny in uncomfortable depth. His dialogues and lost ethical treatises may have offered critiques too bold, too inconvenient, to thrive in imperial or religious contexts. Was his work buried not only by time, but by ideology? And yet, tantalizing hints remain. Throughout medieval Arabic and Syriac scholarship, we find references to Aristotle's lost works. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna engaged deeply with Aristotle's ideas, not only through Greek sources, but through translations and commentaries now lost to the West. Some Arabic translations reference texts unknown to the Latin West. Were these drawn from manuscripts now vanished? Were portions of his lost dialogues preserved outside Europe longer than we thought? To this day, researchers scan medieval libraries in Damascus, Cairo, Istanbul, and Palermo, hoping for a discovery. Could a parchment exist in a monastic vault or a private collection, misattributed or unread for centuries? Could Aristotle's true voice be waiting in a forgotten codex? And then there are the more speculative ideas. Some have proposed that Aristotle's complete works were preserved in the legendary Library of Alexandria, only to perish in fire. Yet no definitive record confirms that his corpus resided there in its entirety. The loss of Alexandria is a symbolic wound, but whether it carried the full weight of Aristotle's genius remains unknown. Others look to hidden caches. During the Crusades and Ottoman conflicts, priceless manuscripts were hidden, moved, stolen. Could they lie in buried chests beneath ancient ruins, in concealed compartments of forgotten churches or synagogues? The notion may sound far-fetched, but history is filled with rediscoveries. The Athenian constitution was believed lost until a papyrus turned up in Egypt in 1890. Might more weight to be found? In our time, Aristotle is remembered as the first scientist, the man who laid the groundwork for empirical reasoning, classification, and critical thinking. Yet, the Aristotle we know may only be a sliver of the man who once was, a philosopher of astonishing range, whose most personal, most polished thoughts are no longer with us. We are left with the question, what truths, what beauty, what insight into the ancient world, and perhaps into our own, lies still hidden somewhere in ink faded by time? And if we found it, would we recognize his voice at all? Amid the ruins of Greece's sacred landscapes, something whispers beneath the surface of stone, something older than myth, yet precise as mathematics, a hidden language, a geometry not only of form but of intention. These temples were not just places of worship. They were instruments, tuned to something that modern science is only beginning to reconsider. Could it be that the architects of ancient Greece encoded within their temples a system of knowledge that has eluded us for centuries? From the outside, a Greek temple may appear symmetrical, orderly, elegant. Yet the more one studies its design, the more questions begin to emerge. Take the Parthenon, for instance, perhaps the most iconic of them all, perched high on the Acropolis above Athens. At first glance, its proportions seem simple, but measure closely, and nothing is quite as it seems. The columns are not evenly spaced. The steps are not perfectly level. The columns lean inward ever so slightly, and the entire structure bulges subtly at its center. This optical refinement is known as entasis, and it serves to counteract natural visual distortions. But was that all it was? Or was it part of a deeper, more esoteric principle? For centuries, architects and historians have marveled at the mathematical precision in Greek temple construction. The use of ratios, especially those related to the so-called golden mean, or phi, appears again and again. Approximately 1 to 1.618, the golden ratio is found in nature, from seashells to galaxies, and in art, from Da Vinci to Le Corbusier. But in Greece, it may have taken on a sacred quality. Why did the architects embed this ratio into their most revered structures? Was it simply an aesthetic choice? Or were they tuning their temples to harmonize with something greater? Consider the Temple of Hephaestus in Athens, or the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Sunion. From their placement to their orientation, nothing was arbitrary. Many Greek temples are aligned not with the city around them, but with celestial events, the solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of particular stars. At Delphi, the Temple of Apollo was oriented toward the rising sun on the feast day of the god himself. At Eleusis, the sanctuary of Demeter appears to have been aligned with the autumnal setting of the Pleiades, a star cluster with deep mythological and agricultural significance. Why such consistency in star-based orientation? Was it symbolic or functional? Could the temples have acted as astronomical tools, calendars in stone, or even points of energetic convergence? In recent decades, researchers from disciplines as diverse as archaeology, mathematics, and geophysics have begun asking deeper questions. Why do so many temples fall along invisible lines, lines that appear to connect sacred sites across vast distances? Some scholars speak of geomantic alignments, patterns that suggest an underlying spatial logic. The idea echoes traditions from other ancient cultures, such as the ley lines of Britain or the axis mundi of Mesoamerican temples. Could it be that the Greeks, too, tapped into some form of earth energy? Or at least believed they did? Theories diverge here. Mainstream archaeologists caution against reading too much into alignments, noting that given enough points, patterns will always emerge. Yet some continue to find compelling anomalies. In Crete, for example, the Temple of Knossos contains a central court precisely aligned with the rising sun at the equinox. Others point to the use of musical intervals in temple layouts, suggesting that sacred geometry may have included acoustic design. If true, then temples were not only seen but heard. They resonated. Could chanting, music, and ritual performed in these spaces have been enhanced by architectural acoustics? Some archaeologists working with 3D reconstructions say yes. The harmony, it seems, was not just metaphorical. And then there are the more speculative interpretations. Certain esoteric traditions claim that Greek temples preserved Pythagorean or Orphic teachings, philosophies that regarded mathematics not as abstraction, but as divine truth. For the Pythagoreans, numbers weren't just tools. They were sacred entities, mediating between the material and the eternal. Was this knowledge embedded in stone? One controversial theory suggests that the temples served as energy amplifiers, designed to channel telluric currents flowing through the earth. Others speak of scalar harmonics, crystalline resonance, or even magnetic influences in the marble itself. These ideas lie far outside the academic mainstream, yet they persist. Why? Because the architecture continues to evoke awe. Because we feel something in these spaces that's hard to explain. Perhaps the greatest mystery lies not in what we see, but in what has been forgotten. Much of Greek architectural knowledge was transmitted orally, or through texts that no longer exist. Vitruvius, writing centuries later in Rome, preserved fragments of design principles, but even his descriptions suggest a lost lineage. What manuals guided the hands of the builders? What philosophies shaped their blueprints? Was there a central tradition, a master geometry, passed down through initiates, architects, priests? Or were the patterns we see the result of intuition and observation refined over generations? Today, archaeologists use satellite imagery and digital modeling to study these alignments. They map ratios, test solar angles, and reconstruct acoustic properties. And still, the mystery deepens. Could the ancients have known more than we give them credit for? Or is it we who are missing the point, assuming symbolism where there was only aesthetics, seeing patterns where there is only coincidence? The line between sacred geometry and subjective interpretation remains thin. But perhaps that is the nature of mystery, to invite us to look again. The stones remain, weathered, silent, yet not lifeless. We stand before them, measuring, analyzing, wondering. What were these temples really for? Were they bridges between heaven and earth, encoded with the language of the cosmos? Or were they merely beautiful structures, elevated by our desire to find meaning in the silence of the ancient past? We may never know, but perhaps, just perhaps, the geometry still speaks. Just beneath the worn flagstones of Athens' ancient marketplace lies the ghost of a voice, once among the loudest, now among the most elusive. A man who claimed to know nothing, yet shaped the very core of Western philosophy. A man whose thoughts changed the world, yet never wrote down a single word. But what if he did? The story of Socrates is one that reverberates through time with uncanny clarity. He lived during the 5th century BC, walked barefoot through the streets of Athens, and engaged strangers in piercing dialogues that often ended with more questions than answers. To some, he was a gadfly, a necessary irritant of Athenian democracy. To others, a corrupter of youth, a threat to the state. His execution by hemlock is one of history's most haunting trials of thought itself. Yet what's most curious is his silence on the page. Socrates, as far as we know, never wrote anything. His words survive only through others, most famously his student Plato, whose dialogues immortalized the teacher's method and mind. Xenophon also wrote of him. Even the playwright Aristophanes ridiculed him on the Athenian stage. But all of these are secondhand, which leads to a persistent, unsettling question. Why did Socrates never write? The standard explanation is both practical and philosophical. Socrates, it is said, distrusted writing. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates recounts an Egyptian myth in which the god Thoth offers the invention of writing to King Thamus. The king declines, warning that writing will cause forgetfulness, substituting memory for external marks and undermining true understanding. Perhaps Socrates truly believed that philosophy was a living art, one that could only breathe through conversation, not ink. Perhaps he feared that writing would fossilize thought. But is that the whole story? Historians have long debated whether Socrates really never wrote anything at all. Could his refusal have been overstated or entirely constructed? Some fragments of ancient sources hint at a more complex reality. A few early writers, now mostly lost to time, vaguely refer to sayings or teachings attributed to Socrates outside of Plato's dialogues. Are these remnants of lost scrolls, misattributions, or echoes of a body of work that once existed but has since vanished? What's especially strange is how central Socrates became to the philosophical tradition, despite his supposed illiteracy in authorship. If his ideas were as disruptive and influential as described, wouldn't it make sense for followers or disciples, other than Plato, to preserve more of his words? We know that Athens was a center of writing, with scrolls copied, sold, and stored in private and public collections. Yet we have no direct text attributed to Socrates, not even an inscription. Is it possible that such writings existed and were intentionally destroyed? Some theorists propose that Socrates may have authored works during his youth, before adopting his later stance against writing. If so, those writings might have contradicted or complicated the image Plato constructed of him. This leads to more provocative questions. Did Plato suppress Socrates' own writings to preserve his own narrative? Plato's dialogues often portray Socrates as a mouthpiece for ideas that increasingly resemble Plato's own philosophy. In later works, Socrates becomes more abstract, less inquisitive, more a figurehead than a man. Was this evolution literary or ideological? Did Plato, knowingly or not, overwrite his teacher? It's a theory some modern scholars entertain quietly, not to discredit Plato, but to consider how historical memory is shaped, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by necessity. The mystery deepens when we consider the political climate of Athens. Socrates' trial and execution were not merely philosophical events. They were political acts. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens was fractured. Socrates had associated with figures like Alcibiades and Critias, men linked with oligarchy and tyranny. In such times, inconvenient ideas and their authors were dangerous. If Socrates had written, especially anything critical of the democracy that later condemned him, those writings might have been destroyed, erased by a city trying to cleanse its own guilt. Book burning is not a modern invention. It is an ancient, often silent violence. And what of the esoteric traditions? Here, the fringe theories begin to stir. Some argue that Socrates may have been more than a philosopher, that he was an initiate of the Eleusinian Mysteries, or a keeper of hidden knowledge passed through oral lineages. In this light, his refusal to write was not just preference, but protection. Was Socrates safeguarding secrets? Esoteric teachings too dangerous or too sacred to be written? These ideas drift far from the mainstream, yet they persist in occult and philosophical circles. In this version of history, Socrates becomes less a philosopher and more a vessel, a conduit of ancient knowledge deliberately hidden from public record. Fanciful, perhaps. But is it impossible? The question then circles back. What did Socrates really believe? We only know what Plato lets us know. And even then, is the Socrates of the dialogues the real man, or a carefully crafted symbol? If Socrates ever wrote even a single scroll, what might it have contained? A lost text, buried in some forgotten tomb, or misattributed in a Roman library, or long since burned in one of the many fires that consumed the ancient world, could change everything. It could redefine our understanding of ethics, of reason, of the self. Or perhaps it would show us a Socrates very different from the wise martyr we think we know. In the fading light of the agora, where once he walked and questioned, the silence grows heavier. The man who changed the course of philosophy left behind no voice of his own. Or did he? Is it possible that the truest words of Socrates lie waiting still, unread, undiscovered, in the cracks between history and myth? And if so, would we recognize his voice at all? In the shadows of ancient Greece, where logic and reason shaped the great philosophies of the West, something wild and uncontained also stirred. A mystery not etched in geometry or syllogism, but in ecstatic chants and veiled rites. A force both divine and feral, unpredictable and holy. This was the world of Dionysus. To the untrained eye, Dionysus was merely the god of wine, a bringer of revelry, a symbol of merriment and intoxication. His statues show him crowned with ivy, holding a thyrsus, a staff wound with grapevines. His image appears in countless frescoes, amphorae, and carvings. But beneath this familiar surface lies something far more enigmatic. The cult of Dionysus was not just a celebration. It was a portal, a threshold into altered states of consciousness, transformation, and, some would say, divine madness. What truly happened in the Dionysian Mysteries? And why did this cult, once suppressed and feared, endure for centuries in the very heart of a civilization built on order and rationality? The roots of the Dionysian tradition stretch deep into the soil of pre-Hellenic Greece, possibly even older. Some scholars trace its origin to Thrace, or even further east, linking Dionysus to fertility gods of the Near East, perhaps to the rites of ancient Palestine, where seasonal death and rebirth deities once held sway. Dionysus is unique among the Olympians, a god who dies and returns, a divine child torn apart and resurrected. In some myths, by the Titans. In others, by Hera's wrath. And always, reborn. What does it mean to worship a god of dismemberment and renewal? What did the followers of Dionysus seek? We find traces of their gatherings carved into the stone theaters of Athens and hidden in the grottos of Delphi and Mount Cithaeron. Here, cloaked in secrecy, initiates, men and women alike, would abandon their identities. They would dance under torchlight, chant sacred hymns, drink from ceremonial vessels, and let the rational self dissolve into something older and stranger. These rituals, known as the Bacchic Mysteries, were said to lead to ecstasy. Ecstasis, a standing outside oneself. But was this merely metaphorical? Or were they truly stepping beyond the boundaries of human consciousness? Ancient accounts hint at something more than performance. Euripides' The Bacchae, though written as a cautionary tale, suggests that the power of Dionysus was not to be trifled with. In the play, the rational king Pentheus tries to suppress the cult, and is literally torn limb from limb by the frenzied women of Thebes, including his own mother. This wasn't just theater, it was a warning. So what was happening in these rituals? Were initiates simply intoxicated by wine and music, losing themselves in the moment? Or did they tap into something deeper, something transcendent? The idea of divine madness, a state in which one becomes possessed by a god, appears across cultures. In India, the Agori mystics. In pre-Columbian America, shamanic vision quests. In the Eleusinian Mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, another Greek cult centered around death and rebirth, initiates reportedly underwent visionary experiences after consuming a sacred kykeon brew. Could the Dionysian rites have involved similar substances? A hallucinogenic potion? A mix of herbs, wine, and perhaps psychoactive plants? Archaeological digs have uncovered cups and containers at ancient Dionysian sites with residues of unusual compounds. Nothing conclusive, but suggestive. Were the ancient Greeks experimenting with consciousness in ways we're only beginning to rediscover? Even more curious is the dual nature of the cult. It was both embraced and outlawed. In Athens, Dionysian festivals, such as the City Dionysia, were state-sponsored events. Yet in Rome, the Bacchanalia, a Roman iteration of the Dionysian cult, was banned in 186 BC. The Roman Senate feared its spread, calling it subversive, dangerous. Why did these rites inspire such reverence and fear? Was it merely a political concern, a response to unregulated gatherings? Or did authorities sense that something truly transformative, or uncontrollable, was happening behind the veils of secrecy? Modern psychologists like Carl Jung saw in Dionysus an archetype, the shadow, the part of the psyche that is repressed, chaotic, emotional. For Jung, the cult offered a symbolic return to the unconscious, the wildness buried beneath civilization. Yet some take this further. In esoteric circles, Dionysus is not simply a symbol. He is an avatar of something older than Olympus, a remnant of prehistoric fertility gods, or even extraterrestrial knowledge preserved in ecstatic rites. Some fringe theorists suggest that the Dionysian cult retained techniques, perhaps even technologies, for inducing altered states that allowed contact with other realms. Is it outlandish? Perhaps, but even in the mainstream, there is growing interest in the use of ritual, music, and plant medicine to access forms of consciousness that defy scientific explanation. Were the Dionysians, in their caves and forest clearings, doing the same? And then there's the question of secrecy. Why were the rites never written down? Why did initiates swear oaths of silence? Like the Eleusinian Mysteries, the Dionysian cult kept its practices hidden from the uninitiated, not out of fear, but out of sanctity. Some knowledge, it seems, was not meant to be profaned by language. But what was it? What did they see? What did they experience? And why does something about Dionysus still haunt us today? In the end, what remains are fragments, ruins of temples draped in ivy, frescoes of dancers with vacant eyes, vases that show wild processions through moonlit forests, and stories of people who stepped outside themselves and never came back the same. Could it be that in the heart of reasoned, orderly Greece there existed a parallel current, one that embraced mystery, ecstasy, and transformation? And if so, where does that current flow now? Is it truly gone? Or does it still pulse, quietly, just beneath the surface of the civilized world, waiting for those willing to dance into the dark and listen to the whispering god of wine, death, and rebirth? What did the followers of Dionysus know that we have forgotten? In this quiet, wind-brushed valley, time seems suspended. But 3,000 years ago, this was the heart of a mighty civilization, the Mycenaeans, builders of fortresses, bearers of gold, and perhaps, as legend tells us, the very people behind the stories of Agamemnon, the Trojan War, and Homer's Iliad. a culture so advanced, so intricately organized, that for centuries it stood as the dominant force in the Aegean. And then, they vanished. By 1200 BC, the palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were thriving. They had written records, linear B tablets, complex trade networks stretching from Crete to Egypt, even into ancient Palestine and the Near East. Their architecture was monumental. Their art reflected both power and refinement. This was no primitive kingdom, but a dynamic, sophisticated world. And yet, within just a few decades, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Writing disappeared. The roads went quiet. And for over 300 years, Greece descended into what historians call the Greek Dark Age. What happened? Why did this civilization, which seemed to have everything, wealth, organization, military prowess, simply fall into ruin? And what do the ruins themselves still whisper if we choose to listen? Mainstream archaeology offers a number of theories. The most widely accepted include natural disasters, earthquakes, droughts, and famines that could have weakened the Mycenaeans' tightly interlinked systems. A single failed harvest might not bring a kingdom down, but repeated environmental stresses, compounded by over-reliance on palace economies, could have destabilized the entire network. Then there's the theory of internal strife, rebellions from within. Perhaps the common people, long subjugated by a powerful elite, finally rose up against their palace overlords. The linear B texts, after all, mention centralized control of resources and a rigid hierarchical society. But none of these explanations feel quite complete. Could something, or someone, else have played a role? Around the same time as the Mycenaeans decline, an unsettling pattern appears across the Mediterranean. Cities burn, palaces fall. From the Levant to Anatolia and even Egypt, once great civilizations are shaken or erased. Historians refer to this as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a cataclysmic, multi-regional event that changed the ancient world forever. At its heart is one of history's great enigmas, the Sea Peoples. They arrive like shadows from the sea, raiders, migrants, invaders, no one knows for certain. Egyptian records describe them as fierce warriors in feathered helmets, sweeping across coasts, toppling cities, and pushing even Pharaoh Ramses III to the brink. Were they involved in the fall of the Mycenaeans? Were the Mycenaeans themselves victims of the very instability they had helped create? Or could they have become the Sea Peoples? Some scholars have speculated that a displaced Mycenaean elite, warriors, sailors, mercenaries, turned to piracy or conquest after their palatial systems collapsed. Their skills, their ships, and their desperation would have made them formidable on the seas, but evidence remains elusive. Another mystery lies in the disappearance of writing. The Mycenaeans used a script called Linear B, adapted from the earlier Minoan Linear A. It was used primarily for administrative purposes, tracking grain, livestock, trade. When the palaces fell, so too did the scribes and the systems that supported them. But rather than evolving into something new, as scripts often do, Linear B vanished entirely. Was literacy so tightly bound to elite bureaucracy that it could not survive without it? Or was there a deliberate erasure? Some fringe theorists suggest a scenario more deliberate and symbolic, that the fall of the Mycenaeans was not merely a collapse, but a purge, a cultural reset, perhaps even influenced by philosophical or religious shifts that sought to destroy the old world to make way for something entirely new. Is there any merit to this? Mainstream scholarship remains skeptical, but the complete silence left in the wake of the Mycenaean collapse, the long centuries before the rise of classical Greece, invites speculation. Still others point to clues buried in mythology. Homer, writing centuries later, spoke of the Trojan War, a war fought by Mycenaean heroes, kings of golden cities. Could the destruction of Troy, or the long campaigns that followed, have drained the Mycenaeans of men and morale? Or are these epics a reflection not of one war, but of many, a cultural memory of collapse, loss, and displacement, encoded into poetry and passed down through generations? What if Homer's dark world of warring kings is more than fiction, but a survivor's song from the edge of a vanished age? Excavations at Mycenaean sites reveal more than just palaces and tombs. Beneath the grandeur lie signs of trauma, burn layers, hastily buried treasures, broken walls never rebuilt. At Pylos, linear B tablets show preparations for defense, lists of chariots, weapons, even references to possible attacks, mere days before the palace was destroyed by fire. Who were they preparing for? What enemy swept across the land, faster than words could record? And what happened to the people who lived here? They did not all die. Many fled, some likely integrated into smaller communities in the hills and islands. And perhaps, just perhaps, their descendants would one day rise again, sparking the rebirth that would become archaic and then classical Greece. But the original Mycenaeans, the palace builders, the script keepers, the traders and poets of that golden age, vanished as a culture. No final battle, no written farewell, just silence. And so, the ruins of Mycenae remain, wind-scoured, sun-bleached, and open to the sky. Tourists pass beneath the Lion Gate, marvel at the Cyclopean walls, and peer into the deep shaft graves once filled with riches. But few realize they are walking among one of history's greatest disappearances. A story with no clear ending. A riddle carved into stone. Was it climate? Invasion? Rebellion? Collapse from within? Or something else entirely? Some mysteries dissolve over time. Others, like the disappearance of the Mycenaeans, only deepen with every discovery. And as we stand amid these crumbling walls, we must ask, what truths still lie buried beneath the olive trees and sunburnt earth? And are we even asking the right questions? Massive. Imposing. Impossibly old. These walls were not made of bricks or cut stones easily lifted by human hands. Instead, they are composed of colossal limestone boulders, some weighing as much as 20 tons. They are rough-hewn, irregular, stacked with uncanny precision, and fused without the use of mortar. Who built them? And more puzzling, how? And perhaps most intriguingly of all, why? Known today as Cyclopean due to their incredible size, these walls were named by the later Greeks, who believed that only the mythical Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of legend, could have moved such enormous stones. The term itself was not used by the Mycenaeans, who built them, but by those who came long after, gazing in awe at a forgotten feat of engineering few could comprehend. The most iconic examples remain at Mycenae and Tiryns, where the walls rise high and thick, forming bastions around ancient citadels. But traces of similar constructions appear throughout the Aegean and even beyond, stretching from the Greek mainland to certain structures in Anatolia, and faint echoes as far away as parts of ancient Palestine. And so, the mystery begins. According to mainstream archaeology, these walls were constructed between 1400 and 1200 BC at the height of Mycenaean power. Their purpose? Defensive, we are told, protection against rival kingdoms and sea raiders. It's a logical explanation. The Late Bronze Age was a turbulent era. Power shifted quickly and cities could be razed overnight. A stronghold with thick walls made sense. But there's a problem. The sheer scale of the Cyclopean masonry is far beyond what was necessary for basic fortification. Even for ceremonial grandeur, the choice to use boulders of this size, requiring unimaginable labor, planning, and coordination, raises questions, especially when smaller, more manageable blocks could have provided comparable protection. Why go to such extremes? Did the builders know something we do not? Consider this. No pulleys or cranes existed in the Mycenaean world, not as far as we know. No iron tools, no advanced mechanical systems. And yet, the stones were not just moved. They were lifted, balanced, and positioned with surgical precision. Modern engineers have puzzled over the logistics. Ramps could have been used, yes. Rollers, perhaps. But over rocky terrain, up steep hills, even with modern equipment, replicating the feat would be daunting. So we must ask, were the Mycenaeans more technologically advanced than we currently believe? Or were they building with knowledge inherited from an even older civilization, one now lost to time? There is a curious silence in the records. The Linear B tablets that survive from this era speak of agriculture, taxation, offerings to gods, but not of construction methods or architectural planning. No blueprint, no manual, no boasting epics. It's as though the walls simply appeared. Were these Mycenaean walls truly built by Mycenaeans? Or were they restoring, repurposing something far more ancient? Fringe theorists have suggested startling possibilities, that the Cyclopean walls are remnants of a pre-Mycenaean culture, perhaps one that had mastered earth-moving techniques long before history remembers. Some even connect the masonry style to structures found as far afield as South America or the Middle East, noting similarities in polygonal stone fitting, though mainstream scholars caution against drawing such sweeping connections without more concrete evidence. Still, the parallels spark curiosity. Could this be evidence of shared ancient knowledge now forgotten, or coincidence born of necessity and human ingenuity? Then there's the question of placement. Many of these walls are not merely protective. They are precisely aligned. At Mycenae, certain gateways and corridors point toward specific celestial events. Some alignments coincide with solstices, others with lunar phases. Could the walls have held a dual function, not just as barriers, but as cosmic markers, temples as much as fortresses? The massive treasury of Atreus, a beehive-shaped tomb near Mycenae, is another clue. Though not a Cyclopean wall per se, its construction shares the same sense of scale, awe, and mystery. Its long entrance passage appears to track the path of the winter solstice sun. Coincidence? Or part of a broader, now lost understanding of astronomy, geometry, and sacred landscape? The mystery deepens when we consider the cultural role of stone in Bronze Age societies. Across ancient civilizations, megalithic structures often served more than practical ends. They conveyed power, permanence, and spiritual significance. Might the Cyclopean walls have symbolized more than defense? Were they statements, perhaps even sacred boundaries, thresholds between the mortal world and the divine? Later Greek myths are curiously silent about their construction, but they are filled with tales of gods and giants, wars between heaven and earth, cities built in a day by supernatural hands. Could these myths be faded memories of real structures whose origins had already become unclear even to the ancients themselves? One unsettling possibility remains, that the Cyclopean walls are a legacy of a forgotten disaster, a final monument built in anticipation of something coming, something cataclysmic, a war, a flood, a shift in the heavens. Why else build walls to last forever? And so, the Cyclopean walls endure. They have outlasted kings and empires, earthquakes and weather, standing mute in the hills for more than 3 millennia. They were here before classical Athens, before Homer sang of heroes, and they remain long after. The answers may lie buried beneath them, or perhaps hidden in the silent spaces between the stones. What knowledge inspired their construction? What hands shaped them? And what purpose, beyond war and protection, might they truly have served? Even today, as we walk their shadowed corridors and brush fingers across their sun-warmed surfaces, we are left to wonder, are these walls merely ruins, or are they messages, carved in stone by a people who knew far more than we imagine, and who feared that one day we might forget? Beneath the palace of Knossos lies a legend, a maze, vast and unfathomable, a place of twisting passageways and dead ends, a prison for a monster, a symbol of power, mystery, and fear. The Labyrinth. But was it real? And if so, what was its true purpose? The myth is famous. According to ancient Greek tradition, the labyrinth was designed by the craftsman Daedalus under the command of King Minos of Crete. Its purpose, to contain the Minotaur, a fearsome creature, half man, half bull, born from divine punishment. For years, Athens was forced to send tributes, young men and women, to be devoured in the dark, until Theseus, the Athenian hero, entered the labyrinth, slew the beast, and found his way out with the help of Ariadne's thread. It's a tale woven with themes of sacrifice, rebellion, and cunning, but it also leaves behind a deeper question. Was there ever a real labyrinth? And if so, what was it really built for? Today, most scholars look to Knossos as the heart of the labyrinth myth. Excavated in the early 20th century by British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, the palace complex at Knossos is sprawling. More than 1,000 interlocking rooms, staircases that seem to lead nowhere, courtyards, storage chambers, ceremonial halls, and twisting corridors that echo with ancient footsteps. To an outsider, especially a visitor from the mainland, the layout might indeed have resembled a maze. But Knossos is not a labyrinth in the literal sense. Its rooms are not designed to trap or disorient, and there is no central chamber where a monster might lurk. So, why did the myth take root here? Is it possible the myth of the labyrinth was inspired by something else? Something more symbolic or more secretive? Some historians believe the labyrinth is not meant to be taken literally. Instead, they argue it was a metaphor, perhaps for the complexity of Cretan society, or the winding spiritual journey of initiation. After all, the Minoan civilization was far older than classical Greece. Flourishing between 2000 and 1450 BC, the Minoans built a culture steeped in ritual, mystery, and symbolism. Their art is filled with serpentine shapes, double axes, known as labris, and sacred bulls. The word labyrinth may even derive from labris, suggesting that the original labyrinth was not a maze at all, but a ceremonial space dedicated to bull worship. If that's the case, then what kind of rituals took place within? There are clues. In the ruins of Knossos, archaeologists have uncovered frescoes showing acrobats leaping over bulls in a kind of sacred performance. Bones of bulls, often split deliberately, have been found in abundance. Could these be the remains of sacrifices? Could the labyrinth have been not a prison but a temple? A place where young initiates faced symbolic death, challenge, or rebirth? And what of the Minotaur itself? Half human, half beast. Was this creature real in some form, or was it a personification of something else? Perhaps the shadow side of human nature, or a ruler's brutal rule. Some suggest the Minotaur represented a foreign power, or even the psychological terror felt by mainland Greeks who were dominated by Crete's advanced and enigmatic civilization. Could it be that the tale of Theseus slaying the Minotaur was more than just myth? Could it have symbolized Athens' eventual triumph over Minoan influence? But the story becomes even stranger when we look beyond Knossos. In other parts of the ancient world, Egypt, Sardinia, even India, we find similar references to maze-like structures and spiral designs used in ritual or sacred architecture. Labyrinthine symbols appear in early Neolithic carvings, on Bronze Age artifacts, and in prehistoric tombs across Europe. In many cases, they seem to be linked not with monsters, but with transitions, from life to death, from ignorance to understanding. Might the labyrinth be part of a much older pattern? A universal symbol echoing across cultures and continents? Or are we seeing patterns where there are none? Fringe theories, too, have taken hold. Some claim that beneath the ruins of Knossos lies a literal labyrinth, still hidden, possibly sealed off by earthquake or time. They point to natural cave systems beneath Crete, like the vast and winding Skotino or Archelokeri caves, as possible inspirations. These underground networks are ancient, eerie, and filled with evidence of past ritual activity. Blades, offerings, signs of fire. Could the real labyrinth have been subterranean? And could the myth remember a truth now buried beneath centuries of dust and ash? Other theories drift further from orthodoxy. Some suggest that the labyrinth was a kind of early observatory, a complex calendar or timekeeping device designed to mark celestial cycles through a journey of corridors. Still others wonder if it was a psychological construct, an initiation path mapped onto real architecture meant to induce altered states of consciousness. Initiates, they suggest, would undergo a ritual passage through darkness and confusion before emerging reborn. But where is the evidence? And how do we separate myth from memory? We return, as always, to the ruins. The stones do not speak, but they suggest. And what they suggest is not simple. Knossos and the tale of the labyrinth remind us how easily history and mythology intertwine, how stories passed through generations can carry hidden truths, half-remembered meanings, or lost technologies behind their metaphors. What was the purpose of the labyrinth? Was it a prison, a sanctuary, or something far more complex? A spiritual map? A memory of something long gone? Or simply a story, told again and again, until its original meaning vanished? Perhaps the most haunting mystery is not whether the labyrinth ever existed, but what it continues to mean. And if, buried beneath Crete or elsewhere, the true labyrinth still waits, lost in shadow, waiting to be discovered. Here, where the wind murmurs through oak leaves and the stones remember voices, once stood a place more ancient than Delphi, older than the Olympian gods themselves. Dodona, a sanctuary shrouded in reverence and mystery. But what truly happened beneath these sacred trees? And why did so many believe that the gods themselves spoke through their rustling leaves? Long before Apollo claimed his oracle at Delphi, before temples were carved into white marble, there was Dodona. The earliest records mention it as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. By Homer's time, it was already considered a place of prophecy, dark, wild, and foreign in tone. In the Iliad, Achilles himself seeks counsel from Zeus at Dodona, not through priests, but through the whispering of sacred trees. Unlike Delphi, Dodona did not begin with a shining temple or the voice of a young priestess intoxicated by vapors. Here, the oracle was elemental, raw, rooted in nature. The heart of it was a massive oak tree. And it was not the priests who spoke, it was the tree itself. The practice was simple and strange. Worshippers came from across the Greek world to ask questions. These could range from personal dilemmas to political or military campaigns. But instead of seeking visions or ecstatic utterances, the priests, called Seloi, watched the natural world. They observed the wind in the leaves, the flight of doves, the clang of copper cauldrons hung nearby. They listened to the sound of leaves rustling, and from these movements drew divine meaning. But how? What language did they hear in the whisper of the wind? And more importantly, was it ever real? Mainstream historians and archaeologists point to a deep human tendency to seek patterns in nature. In a world without modern science, interpreting omens was part of daily life. The Seloi, sleeping on the ground and keeping their feet unwashed as a sign of humility, were thought to be closer to the earth, able to read the language of nature as if it were scripture. But Dodona's methods seem unusually persistent and uniquely venerated. Even when Delphi rose in prominence, Dodona remained vital. Kings and generals, including the likes of Pyrrhus of Epirus and even Alexander the Great, sent envoys to consult the oracle. Why? Could there have been something more to the rituals? Was the rustling of leaves just a metaphor? Or was it part of a forgotten science? Some researchers have speculated that Dodona's oak tree may have been chosen for more than spiritual reasons. Ancient oaks, with their deep roots and iron-rich environments, can respond subtly to shifts in magnetic fields. Could the movement of air through these branches have interacted with other natural forces, electrical, magnetic, or acoustic? Nearby, bronze vessels were suspended around the tree. When struck by the wind or gently knocked by chords, they would ring, a chorus of tones echoing through the grove. Could the resonance of these vibrations have induced altered states of consciousness or a trance-like focus? Might this have been an ancient form of acoustic ritual, a natural symphony, mistaken for the voice of Zeus? And then, there are the more speculative theories. Some fringe researchers suggest that Dodona may have been an early energy site, aligned along ley lines, those supposed invisible paths of geophysical force. According to this view, the grove's location was no accident. It was chosen not just for its sacred oak, but for its access to telluric currents, the same kinds of energies believed by some to influence places like Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids. Others suggest Dodona was a memory, a cultural echo of something older still. In Egyptian tradition, Herodotus writes that the oracle at Dodona was founded by a priestess carried from Thebes. She did not speak Greek, yet she was received as a messenger of Zeus. Was this simply Greek myth retrofitting itself onto foreign wisdom? Or did a cross-cultural transmission of ritual knowledge occur, one we can no longer fully trace? Is it possible that Dodona represents a link between forgotten systems of knowledge and what we now call myth? And what of the Seloi themselves? They appear in the historical record and then fade. They were not the glamorous Pythias of Delphi nor the polished priests of Olympia. Their methods were simple, earthbound. They lay on the soil. They interpreted the sky. They listened to trees. But in a world increasingly dominated by rationality, such practices were slowly dismissed. Eventually, Dodona was eclipsed. Earthquakes damaged the site. The oak tree was lost. Christianity arrived, and the voice of the leaves was silenced. What remains now are stones. Stone foundations, stone altars, stone inscriptions, some of them preserved. Many of the questions posed to the oracle have survived, etched in lead tablets. They ask about fertility, travel, betrayal. They ask about missing goats, wandering sons, dangerous journeys. But the answers have vanished. The rustling leaves no longer speak. So what truly happened at Dodona? Was it merely an ancient superstition, a poetic interpretation of random wind? Or was it something more? A ritual system built around deep attention to the natural world, now forgotten by modern minds. Was it a place of divine communion? A natural symphony misread as magic? Or something more esoteric, more complex than we have yet imagined? In the silence of Dodona's grove, with its fallen stones and vanished tree, we are left only with echoes. The wind still stirs, the sky still watches, and perhaps, just perhaps, something ancient still waits to be heard. A whisper, a message, still rustling, just beyond the edge of understanding. In this place, once walked a voice. Not just any voice, but one so powerful, so intimate, and so uniquely lyrical that even centuries later, fragments of her words still pulse with life. Her name was Sappho, but most of her poetry is lost. Why? And what might those missing lines still tell us? Sappho of Lesbos lived in the 7th century BC in a world of lyric poetry and rising city-states. Unlike the epic grandeur of Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, her verses were personal, tender, and emotionally raw. She wrote of love and longing, of beauty and jealousy. She wrote in the first person, and she addressed not kings or gods, but other women. Her poetry was performed with the lyre, giving it a musicality now mostly gone. She was known throughout the ancient world, revered by Plato as the 10th muse, and by later poets as a kind of divine voice. Yet today, only a fraction of her work remains. Of the hundreds of poems she likely composed, only one survives in near complete form. The rest? Scattered fragments, torn by time. How does such a voice disappear? Some of it is the natural erosion of history. Papyrus decays, fires consume libraries, wars scatter scrolls, but with Sappho, the gaps feel deliberate, unsettlingly selective. For much of antiquity, she was admired. Her verses were preserved in 9 books at the Library of Alexandria. Ancient scholars even classified them by meter and subject. But by the Byzantine era, her work began to vanish. Some say it was a casualty of shifting cultural tides. Her themes, centered on female desire and same-sex intimacy, increasingly considered inappropriate by emerging religious authorities. Monks, tasked with copying texts, prioritized theology and philosophy over lyric passion. Her works were no longer transcribed, and without transcription, papyrus rots. Parchment is reused. Texts disappear. Was her erasure merely practical, or was it intentional? The mystery deepens when we consider how fragments of her poetry have resurfaced through the most improbable means. In 1896, archaeologists in Egypt uncovered a garbage mound in the desert near Oxyrhynchus. There, buried under centuries of sand and refuse, they found scraps of ancient papyrus, discarded pages, private letters, lost books. Among them, fragments of Sappho. More surfaced in the decades that followed, bits of verses embedded in the wrappings of Egyptian mummies, their strips of papyrus reused for funerary masks. And then, in 2014, a startling announcement. 2 previously unknown poems, more complete than any found in over a century, surfaced in the hands of a private collector. The Brothers poem and another untitled piece were authenticated by scholars, but their origin remains murky. Who possessed them? How were they preserved for over 2 millennia? And how many more poems still lie hidden in private collections, sealed crates, or forgotten storerooms? These rediscoveries spark new questions about what was lost and why. Some theories suggest her works were targeted during the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Her exploration of female love, however nuanced or symbolic, may have drawn condemnation. Later commentators, especially in medieval Europe, either ignored or mischaracterized her. Others point to the limitations of preservation. Sappho wrote in a specific dialect, Aeolic Greek, which grew increasingly obscure. Fewer scribes could understand her. Fewer felt compelled to preserve her. But even this cannot fully explain the disappearance. Why were 9 entire volumes lost? Why are the surviving pieces so scattered, so rare? Could there have been efforts, quiet, systematic, and effective, to silence her voice? And what of the surviving lines? Despite their brevity, they vibrate with power. One fragment reads, "Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time." Simple, haunting, prescient. Another, "You came, and I was longing for you. You cooled my heart that burned with desire." These aren't the lofty invocations of gods or heroes. They are deeply human, specific, vulnerable, and in that, possibly dangerous to the structures that later came to dominate history's narrative. Could it be that the most radical part of Sappho's legacy wasn't her style, but her gaze? She spoke not of women, but to them. Not as ideals, but as lovers, as friends, as equals. In doing so, did she challenge the foundations of a patriarchal world? Even her persona is elusive. Ancient commentators debated whether she was merely poetic or openly autobiographical. Was she a schoolmistress teaching girls? A priestess of Aphrodite? A noblewoman? A recluse? Some even denied she existed at all, suggesting Sappho was a literary invention. Yet the consistency of her voice, the references from other ancient writers, and the raw immediacy of her verses make this unlikely. She was real. But the record of her life, like her poetry, has been fractured. Why does so little remain? Who controlled what was preserved, and who decided what was forgotten? As we piece together the fragments, verse by verse, line by line, we are left with a haunting sense of incompleteness. Sappho's words have survived 2.5 millennia not because they were preserved, but in spite of not being preserved. They surfaced through chance, through trash heaps and mummy wrappings, through collectors and accidents. How many more might remain? Locked away in dusty archives, mislabeled, waiting in sunken ships, or lost forever, the words dissolved in time? And what might those lost poems have told us? About love? About power? About a world seen not through the lens of warriors and kings, but through the eyes of a poet who sang to the soul? We will never know. But perhaps, just perhaps, someone, somewhere, still holds a scroll, a hidden verse, a final whisper from the 10th muse. In an age of swords and spears, of siege engines and bronze armor, few weapons instilled as much terror as this one. Not because of its size, not because of its sound, but because it shouldn't have existed. Fire, liquid, unquenchable, launched from ships, consuming enemy fleets even as they tried to retreat into the safety of the sea. How was this possible? And even more mysteriously, how was it lost? Greek fire, also known as sea fire, liquid fire, or Roman fire, was a formidable weapon developed in the Eastern Roman Empire, often referred to by modern historians as the Byzantine Empire. It first appeared in recorded history in the 7th century AD, though some believe the knowledge could have roots stretching back into classical Greece. Its use became legendary during naval battles, particularly in defending Constantinople from Arab sieges. Witnesses described it as a stream of flame hurled from tubes or siphons, a fire that clung to ships and bodies, igniting everything in its path. Most chillingly, it could not be extinguished with water. Imagine being a sailor, trapped on a wooden vessel, surrounded by flame that floats. Panic, chaos, no escape. But for all its horrifying power, what Greek fire actually was remains unknown. No recipe survives. No diagram has been preserved. It is, quite literally, a weapon erased from the historical record. Historical accounts speak in whispers and riddles. The 10th century Byzantine military manual Tactica, attributed to Emperor Leo VI, warned that the secret formula for Greek fire was so guarded that even emperors themselves were not always entrusted with it. Knowledge of its creation was passed down through select engineers, never written down, never shared beyond the palace. Was it petroleum? A mixture of pine resin and sulfur? Was it launched with compressed air, or with simple bellows? Some theorize that saltpeter or quicklime was involved, materials that, when combined, could produce intense combustion even on water. But without physical evidence, we don't know. We only have clues, scattered across centuries. And some of those clues suggest the story might be even stranger than we realize. The most commonly cited origin story credits a Syrian engineer named Callinicus of Heliopolis. Fleeing the Arab conquest of the Levant in the 7th century, he is said to have brought with him the knowledge of creating this infernal mixture. He offered his services to Emperor Constantine IV, who used Greek fire to devastating effect against the Arab fleet besieging Constantinople in 672 AD. But here's where the trail begins to blur. Some scholars argue that Callinicus was merely a transmitter, not an inventor. They point to older references in ancient Greek literature that hint at fire-based weapons. The Historia of Thucydides, and even some Homeric passages, mention the use of flammable substances in siege warfare. Could the knowledge have come from even earlier? From Alexandria? From pre-Hellenistic Egypt? Or further still, lost cities of the Near East where alchemy and metallurgy advanced long before the Greco-Roman world? There are tales, half history, half rumor, of fire formulas written in ancient scrolls kept in the great libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon. Some believe they were encoded in riddles or poetic verse to mask their true purpose. Were these texts destroyed? Or were they hidden? More tantalizing still are the technological implications. Some reconstructions suggest Greek fire may have required a pressurized siphon, a kind of ancient flamethrower. But how could 7th century engineers have built such a device without modern mechanics? There are mentions of bronze tubes mounted on ships connected to tanks. Crews turned cranks or bellows, and jets of fire would pour forth. The concept sounds implausibly advanced, and yet Byzantine naval records confirm it was used and feared. Did the engineers of Constantinople unlock a chemical principle forgotten by later generations? Did they discover a formulation that today's chemists still struggle to reverse engineer? Or was it something else entirely? Some fringe theories have taken the mystery further. They suggest that Greek fire may have involved an ingredient no longer available, perhaps a form of naphtha extracted from a now-lost location, or a naturally occurring chemical compound that has since disappeared from known trade routes. Others speculate that the secret was never written down because it wasn't just chemical, it was spiritual. That the mixing of the ingredients involved not just formulas, but rituals, a sacred fire, bound to the empire, passed down through a priestly or esoteric class. These ideas are difficult to verify, and often dismissed by mainstream historians. Yet, the mystery remains. How could such a powerful invention vanish so completely? The final confirmed use of Greek fire was in the 12th century. After that, the knowledge appears to fade. The Crusaders, despite their conquest of Constantinople in 1204, never adopted the weapon. No Western power recreated it. Even the Ottomans, who inherited much of the Byzantine legacy, had no access to its secrets. Could it be that the very success of Greek fire doomed it? That in keeping it secret, the Byzantines ensured its eventual disappearance? Or perhaps someone destroyed the last formula intentionally to prevent its misuse, to erase a terrifying legacy from the face of the earth. Today, chemists and historians alike continue to search. Experiments have tried to recreate Greek fire using combinations of petroleum, pitch, and lime. Some have managed to replicate its burning on water effect, but none have achieved the precise lethality described in ancient texts. And still, questions linger. What exactly was Greek fire? How was it delivered with such precision? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did no one ever rediscover it? In a world where so much has been preserved, where even the ideas of the ancients echo through our sciences and philosophies, this one flame, once so feared, so unstoppable, has gone dark. But perhaps, somewhere, deep in the archives of forgotten manuscripts, behind cryptic passages or coded diagrams, the secret still waits. What would happen if we found it? Would we dare light it again? They were known as the sons of Ares, the embodiment of discipline, fearlessness, and control. Spartan warriors, etched into history as symbols of martial perfection. But behind the myth, behind the bronze shields and crimson cloaks, lies a puzzle rarely discussed. What were the true battle tactics of the Spartans? What did they know that we do not? From childhood, a Spartan boy was raised not by comfort, but by hardship. Taken from his family at the age of 7, he entered the agoge, a brutal state-sponsored training regime designed to strip away weakness and forge an unbreakable soldier. By adulthood, the Spartan warrior had become a living weapon, and yet, for all we've read about their toughness, very little is truly understood about how they fought. What made them so effective? Why did so few stand against so many and win? The most iconic Spartan tactic is, of course, the phalanx, a wall of shields, overlapping and impenetrable, spears jutting outward in a unified thrust. It was the engine of many Greek armies, but Sparta refined it, perfected it, lived it. Each warrior stood shoulder to shoulder, not as individuals, but as one body. The front rank bore the brunt of the fighting, while others pushed from behind, maintaining the pressure, the cohesion, the relentless advance. Their shields, aspis, were built not just to protect the man holding them, but to guard the man beside them. This principle of trust and interdependence was the heart of Spartan combat. But the mystery is this: the phalanx was not unique to Sparta. Athens, Thebes, and other city-states used it too, yet none commanded the same fear. Why? What did the Spartans add or conceal? Some historians argue that the Spartans possessed advanced tactical flexibility rarely acknowledged in traditional records. They weren't just a wall of spears. They adapted, maneuvered, and deceived. Herodotus mentions instances during the Battle of Plataea where Spartans feigned retreat, luring Persian forces into chaos before turning and striking with lethal coordination. Could it be that Spartan warfare included a mastery of psychological warfare? Of controlling the pace of battle, reading enemy movements, and executing traps far more subtle than history credits them for? Others point to their uncanny ability to maintain formation under impossible odds. At Thermopylae, Leonidas and his 300 did not simply die in a futile stand. They held off tens of thousands for 3 days, rotating frontline soldiers with uncanny precision. Was this simply training? Or were their tactics not recorded? One of the enduring enigmas lies in how little the Spartans wrote down. Unlike Athens, which left behind reams of political philosophy, plays, and treatises on warfare, Sparta cultivated silence. Discipline extended to thought and word. Much of what we know comes from outsiders, often enemies or later admirers. How much has been lost in that silence? Some fringe theorists go further, suggesting that Spartan tactics might have included unconventional strategies, espionage, covert operations, even early forms of guerrilla warfare. Their elite unit, the Crypteia, was a secretive corps of young warriors tasked with operating in the shadows, testing themselves by stalking and eliminating threats in the countryside. Were they simply a tool of domestic control, as many believe? Or could they have formed the basis of a hidden doctrine of irregular warfare? A strategy not of confrontation, but infiltration. Then there are the weapons themselves. While many Greek hoplites used similar equipment, spear, shield, short sword. The Spartan xiphus was often shorter, designed for close quarters, even grappling. Some believe this was an intentional adaptation for the tightest formations, or for striking beneath the shield line. Others speculate it points to a deeper fighting system, perhaps an unrecorded martial art, passed only through the agoge, its moves never taught to outsiders. Could the Spartans have developed a unique combat form, never written down, never observed by historians? We know they valued silence, precision, efficiency. It is not impossible. Geography, too, may have played a role in shaping their tactics. Surrounded by mountains with few roads in or out, Laconia created isolation. Sparta did not rely on large walls like other cities. Instead, they relied on fear and readiness. Every man was a soldier, every citizen a guardian. Their army was not a seasonal force, it was a way of life. Did this allow them to craft a war doctrine designed for defensive terrain? Narrow passes, ambush points, strategies not of battlefield confrontation alone, but of terrain manipulation, of slow attrition, of forcing an enemy into unfamiliar ground? Thermopylae may not have been an exception, but an echo of a larger philosophy. And then, of course, there is what was never spoken aloud. The possibility that the Spartan war machine was more than training and tactics, but a product of belief. Their entire system, education, politics, religion, was structured to serve war. They saw warfare not as chaos, but as order, a sacred duty. Every maneuver, every movement in the phalanx was part of a larger harmony. The rhythm of war was, to them, a kind of music. Could their understanding of combat have been guided not just by strategy, but by something deeper? Ritual? Spirituality? Modern scholars have tried to piece together fragments, analyzing battle sites, testing phalanx formations, reconstructing shield techniques, and yet, the full picture remains elusive, because Sparta was not just a military force, it was a worldview, a culture so tightly controlled, so insular, that it left behind few blueprints, just echoes in stone, references in the writings of others, and the unsettling knowledge that even now, we do not fully understand how they fought. What secrets might still lie buried in Laconia? What tactics were whispered from elder to youth in the shadows of the agoge? And if we could see the true Spartan battle doctrine, would we recognize it? Or would it challenge everything we think we know about ancient war? The silence of Sparta endures, and in that silence, the mystery waits. On this small island in the Aegean Sea, sometime in the 6th century BC, a man was born whose name would reverberate through the corridors of mathematics, philosophy, and mystery for over 2 millennia. Pythagoras. But who was he, truly? To most, the name conjures a familiar image, a Greek philosopher in a white robe, calculating the properties of right-angled triangles. The Pythagorean theorem, A2 plus B2 equals C2, is often taught as his enduring legacy. Yet, when we look beyond the tidy numbers and classroom formulas, the figure of Pythagoras becomes blurry, shrouded, fragmented. He is not just a mathematician, but a prophet, a mystic, perhaps even something more. The deeper we search, the less we find. And the more we begin to wonder, was Pythagoras a man or a myth? Ancient records tell us little with certainty. Born around 570 BC on the island of Samos, Pythagoras reportedly traveled extensively in his youth. Journeys that would take him to Egypt, Babylon, and perhaps even farther east. In Egypt, some claim he studied with temple priests, absorbing sacred geometry, numerology, and spiritual discipline. In Babylon, he may have encountered astronomical traditions and mathematical systems far older than Greece itself. But how much of this is fact? And how much legend? We know that in his later years, Pythagoras founded a community in the southern Italian city of Croton, a kind of philosophical and spiritual brotherhood, part school, part cult. Its members lived by strict rules. They practiced vegetarianism, believed in the transmigration of souls, and pursued harmony through mathematics. Silence, discipline, and ritual were central. Outsiders were not welcome. Strangely, no writings by Pythagoras himself have survived. Everything we know comes secondhand, recorded centuries later by followers or philosophers who may never have known him. Even the famed theorem that bears his name appears in Babylonian clay tablets dating back over 1,000 years before his time. Did he discover it, or was he merely the one to teach it in a new philosophical light? Why attribute this knowledge to him at all? As we sift through the testimonies of antiquity, Pythagoras begins to dissolve into contradiction. Some say he was a miracle worker. Others say he could recall his past lives in perfect detail. There are stories, odd and otherworldly, of him calming animals with his voice, predicting natural disasters, even being in two places at once. Were these tales symbolic or sincere? To his followers, Pythagoras was more than a teacher. He was a divine figure. They called him the Hyperborean Apollo, a reference to a mythic land of purity and light. His teachings were often expressed not through equations but through cryptic maxims, such as "do not eat beans" or "do not step over a crossbar." To outsiders, these rules were baffling, but to initiates, they held deeper meaning, lessons encrypted in metaphor. Did Pythagoras believe that numbers were not merely quantities, but forces, beings, even gods? His philosophy centered on harmony, the idea that the cosmos was ordered through numerical relationships. Music, astronomy, ethics, all could be explained through proportions. To him, numbers were the key to understanding the divine. But was this insight born of reason or revelation? In modern times, scholars have struggled to separate the historical Pythagoras from the legend. Some suggest there were two Pythagorases, one a philosopher, the other a mythical figure whose story was exaggerated by centuries of mystics and metaphysicians. Others believe he was a conduit, an assembler of ancient traditions absorbed from foreign cultures, repackaged in Greek language and thought. There are whispers of him traveling even farther east, to Persia, to India, where he may have encountered Vedic concepts of reincarnation and cosmic cycles. The similarities between Pythagorean beliefs and early Hindu philosophy are striking. Both speak of the soul's journey. Both see the universe as a web of vibrational order. But again, no proof, only echoes. Suggestion. Some fringe theories go deeper still. They claim Pythagoras may have been part of a hidden lineage of ancient wisdom, a keeper of sacred knowledge that predated even the pyramids. Others tie him to Atlantis, to Orphic mystery cults, or to lost technologies of sound and resonance. His fascination with harmonic ratios, how simple numbers create beautiful tones when plucked on a lyre, has led some to speculate he believed sound could heal or even manipulate reality. Too far-fetched? Or have we simply lost the lens through which his teachings once made sense? What makes Pythagoras so elusive is not just the loss of records, it is the deliberate secrecy. He instructed his disciples never to reveal the inner workings of their community. Their rites, rituals, and discoveries were kept hidden from the outside world. Those who violated these oaths were cast out, or worse. Why such strict silence? Was it fear of persecution, or protection of something more powerful? Centuries later, his influence would ripple through time, into Plato's dialogues, into early Christian mysticism, into Renaissance alchemy. Even today, the idea of a universe built on mathematical order continues to guide physicists and cosmologists. Yet we still do not know the man behind the name. Standing among the quiet ruins of Samos or Croton, one can't help but feel the presence of something unfinished. A voice not silenced, but hidden, encoded in numbers, buried in symbols, waiting for the right key to unlock it. Who was Pythagoras? A mathematician? A mystic? A traveler between worlds? Or simply a mirror, reflecting ancient knowledge whose origins lie even deeper in time? The truth, like his teachings, remains veiled. But perhaps, just perhaps, we have not yet asked the right questions. Here, at the foot of the Athenian Acropolis, drama was born. Not merely entertainment, but something deeper, darker. Greek tragedy, one of the most profound and haunting legacies of the ancient world, emerged from this very ground. But its origins remain cloaked in ambiguity, echoing with questions that have never been fully answered. What gave rise to this art form that dared to confront death, fate, and the fragile boundary between human and divine? Why did it appear, seemingly without precedent, with such poetic and psychological complexity? And most of all, who first gave tragedy its voice? By the 5th century BC, Greek tragedy had become central to Athenian civic life. Each spring, during the festival of Dionysia, thousands would gather to witness the great plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These performances were more than spectacle. They were ritual, sacred, a public reckoning with destiny, hubris, and the gods. But where did it all begin? Tradition tells us it started with a figure named Thespis, around 534 BC. He is said to have been the first to step out from the chorus and speak as an individual character, an innovation so powerful that his name became synonymous with acting itself. Thespians still honor him today. Yet even this simple origin is contested. No scripts survive from Thespis, no clear account of his methods or themes. Was he a lone innovator, or merely the first name remembered in a much older tradition? Some believe tragedy grew directly from the dithyramb, a choral hymn sung in honor of Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and rebirth. These early performances involved masked singers, dancing in circular formations, invoking primal energy. The transition from this ecstatic group ritual to structured drama is often explained as a natural evolution. But how does one explain the sudden depth? The earliest surviving tragedies, like Aeschylus's The Persians, are complex, layered, and psychologically rich. They wrestle with abstract ideas of justice, guilt, and divine will. These were not simple tales. They spoke of inherited curses, cosmic vengeance, and the terrifying unknowability of the gods. Could such sophistication have emerged in a single generation? Some scholars have pointed toward influences beyond Greece, suggesting that tragedy may have drawn from far older, even foreign ritual traditions. The Egyptians had long used sacred drama in their temple rites, reenacting the death and resurrection of Osiris. In the East, Mesopotamian laments, performed in communal gatherings, used poetic dirges to mourn the fall of cities and kings. Could traveling priests or thinkers have carried these forms westward, where they blended with Greek song and myth? Others see clues in the very structure of the theater. Theatron, the seeing place, was more than a space for storytelling. It was a conduit between worlds. The circular orchestra, where the chorus sang and danced, may have represented the cosmos itself. The masks, grotesque, expressive, otherworldly, were not merely theatrical devices. They transformed the wearer, evoking presence beyond the mortal. Was Greek tragedy a remnant of a shamanic tradition, one that used voice, rhythm, and archetype to pierce the veil between seen and unseen? And what of Dionysus himself? A strange, ambiguous god, joyous yet savage, the god of ecstasy, whose name literally means twice born. Some have argued that tragedy began not as an art form, but as a sacrificial rite in his honor, where a symbolic scapegoat was paraded, honored, and ritually destroyed. The term tragoidia, from which we derive tragedy, means goat song. Was the first actor, then, a substitute victim? In this view, every tragic hero, Oedipus, Agamemnon, Antigone, is a modern echo of the ancient scapegoat, chosen, revered, and destroyed to restore balance. But this too remains theory. There are no records of these supposed pre-dramatic rituals, only fragments, hints, shadows. We do know that tragedy was deeply connected to civic identity. The plays were state-sponsored. Citizens watched as their leaders were brought low, their gods questioned, their myths reinterpreted with brutal honesty. Was this an early form of political therapy? A controlled purge of fear and guilt? The philosopher Aristotle believed so. In his Poetics, he described tragedy's function as catharsis, a purging of pity and terror through emotional experience. But Aristotle was writing a century after the golden age of tragedy had passed. His ideas, though influential, are interpretations, not eyewitness accounts. And then, abruptly, it ended. By the 4th century BC, tragedy, as it had been known, began to fade. Comedy rose in prominence. Newer playwrights like Menander focused on domestic life, not divine struggle. The old themes of hubris and doom fell silent. Why? Was it a shift in cultural values? A political realignment? Or had tragedy served its mysterious purpose and simply dissolved, leaving only its echoes behind? As we walk the empty rows of the Theater of Dionysus today, we hear none of the voices, but we feel them. The cries of Cassandra, the silence of Iphigenia, the final breath of Oedipus. They remain, etched not in marble, but in the cultural memory of a civilization that once dared to face its gods and gaze into the abyss. Where did Greek tragedy come from? From ritual? From foreign influence? From something older still? Or is its origin lost? Not just to time, but deliberately veiled, because the truths it touched were too raw, too sacred, to ever be fully revealed. Perhaps tragedy, like the Dionysian rites from which it may have sprung, was never meant to explain, only to confront. And as we stand in the shadow of these ancient stones, we are left to wonder what other voices, older, stranger, forgotten, once called out from the chorus, and whether we are still listening. The Orphic hymns, 40-odd poetic invocations addressed to gods, forces, and primordial powers. At first glance, they seem like any other religious verses of the ancient Greek world. Prayers, praise, ritual formulas. But look closer, and something else begins to emerge. A code, a hidden language of symbols, a veiled cosmology that doesn't just venerate the gods. It seeks to become them. Who wrote these hymns? And more importantly, why? The Orphic hymns are attributed to Orpheus, the mythical musician who could charm rocks and rivers with his lyre, and who dared to descend into the underworld in search of his lost love, Eurydice. He is a figure suspended between worlds, human and divine, mortal and initiate. But Orpheus the man, if he ever lived, is nowhere to be found in the historical record. What remains is the tradition that bears his name, Orphism. Unlike the mainstream Olympian religion, Orphism was mystical, introspective, and exclusive. Its adherents followed secret rites and doctrines. They believed in reincarnation, divine punishment after death, and ultimately, the possibility of liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Salvation, not through worship alone, but through gnosis, knowledge. And at the heart of this movement lay the hymns. Composed sometime between the 3rd and 2nd century BC in Asia Minor, possibly near the city of Pergamon, the hymns are surprisingly structured. Each one is devoted to a deity: Apollo, Dionysus, Nyx, Kronos, the Moirai. But their language is not merely mythic, it's esoteric. The gods described are not simply personalities, they are cosmic forces, archetypes, metaphysical principles. So what were these hymns truly for? Were they prayers or spells? Unlike the epics of Homer, the Orphic hymns were not intended for public recitation in large gatherings or dramatic festivals. Their setting was intimate, private. A few initiates gathered in candlelight, reciting chants and offering incense. Instructions for ritual offerings, frankincense, myrrh, saffron, honey, accompany many of the hymns, suggesting a precise, possibly alchemical component. But it's the content that disturbs our conventional understanding of Greek religion. The hymn to Night, Nyx, does not depict a goddess of sleep or dreams. It invokes her as the mother of gods, the source of all creation, even superior to the famed Olympians. The hymn to Dionysus, far from merely celebrating wine or revelry, speaks of death and rebirth, dismemberment and transformation. Why such emphasis on suffering, transformation, and hidden knowledge? Some believe the hymns were tools of spiritual ascent, that their recitation, paired with ritual, allowed the initiate to rise through the celestial spheres, shedding layers of the self, until what remained was pure soul, divine essence. In this view, each hymn was a key, each god a gatekeeper. This is not unlike later Neoplatonic or Gnostic traditions, where the material world is seen as a trap, and salvation comes through inward journey and metaphysical awakening. Could Orphism and its hymns have been the forerunners of these later movements? Others suggest the hymns conceal astronomical or cosmological knowledge. Scholar Otto Kern believed that some of the verses encoded planetary alignments or seasonal cycles. The references to light and dark, to descending and ascending spirits, may hint at a deeper understanding of time, perhaps even of the precession of the equinoxes, known to only the most advanced ancient minds. And then, there is the theory of the Dionysian Code. Some modern interpreters propose that the Orphic hymns were written by a secret brotherhood, keepers of an ancient pre-Greek theology centered not on Zeus, but on Dionysus. According to Orphic myth, Dionysus Zagreus was the son of Zeus and Persephone. As a child, he was torn apart by the Titans, only to be resurrected. In some traditions, the ashes of his dismembered body were used to fashion humankind. If true, this would mean humanity is both divine and Titan-born, part light, part darkness. A fall from grace encoded not in sin, but in origin. What if the hymns were composed as a remembrance of this fall? Or worse, as a guide for reversing it? But the mystery deepens when we consider the influence of Orphic thought on later traditions. The philosopher Pythagoras, himself shrouded in legend, is said to have been deeply influenced by Orphic doctrine. His belief in transmigration of souls, in the divine nature of numbers, and in music as a path to cosmic harmony, all echo Orphic themes. Plato, too, in his Republic, hints at Orphic ideas, especially in his descriptions of the afterlife and the soul's journey beyond death. Was Orphism a mystical undercurrent beneath Greek philosophy? Or was it something older still? Some fringe theories suggest the Orphic hymns are remnants of a forgotten pre-Hellenic wisdom tradition, perhaps even influenced by contacts with ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Persia. The Zoroastrian hymns known as Gathas bear structural similarities. Egyptian funerary texts also describe journeys of the soul through night and shadow. Could these cultures have shared more than just trade routes? Even more speculative are theories linking Orphism to lost Atlantean knowledge or prehistoric shamanism. traditions that encoded their insights in myth and music, passing them down through oral initiation until they were finally written in cryptic verse. These claims remain outside the bounds of mainstream scholarship, but the absence of definitive answers keeps the door open, just a little. Today, the Orphic hymns survive only in fragments, preserved in obscure manuscripts studied by classicists, theologians, and occultists alike. Their meanings remain elusive. Each line seems simple, yet layered. An invocation, a metaphor, a key to something just beyond our grasp. Why the secrecy? Why the ambiguity? Were the Orphic initiates guarding something sacred or something dangerous? We may never know. But as long as the hymns survive, they whisper to us still, from temples long ruined, from cults long buried. They beckon us not merely to understand, but to remember. And so we ask, what deeper knowledge lies veiled in these verses? What ancient wisdom might still be hidden in the folds of this forgotten theology? And most haunting of all, were the Orphic hymns meant to praise the gods or to awaken the god within? For centuries, the Athenian navy stood as the unshakable pillar of power in the ancient Mediterranean. It was not just a military force, it was a floating treasury, an engine of influence, and the foundation of a democratic empire. At its peak during the 5th century BC, Athens boasted over 300 triremes, sleek, triple-decked warships crewed by thousands of oarsmen, all financed through vast reserves of silver, tribute, and war spoils. But somewhere along the way, something vanished. The numbers don't quite add up. The wealth once meticulously recorded in inscriptions, tribute lists, and naval ledgers, gold talents by the hundreds, simply fades from history. There are no dramatic thefts, no fiery sackings, no catastrophes to explain it. And yet, by the time Macedon rose under Philip and later Alexander, the treasury of the once proud Athenian fleet was gone. Where did it go? To understand the gravity of this disappearance, we must return to the heart of Athens' naval power. Delos. In 478 BC, the Delian League was formed under the pretense of a collective Greek defense against Persian aggression. Member states, ranging from the islands of the Aegean to distant colonies in Ionia, contributed ships, or more often, tribute in silver, to a centralized treasury, originally housed in a sacred temple on the island of Delos. But within decades, the treasury was moved, some say controversially, to the Acropolis in Athens. With it came extraordinary control over the wealth of the Greek world. This transfer marked the rise of what historians call the Athenian Empire. The city-states leaders, Pericles chief among them, used these funds not only to maintain the navy, but to construct monuments, pay civic stipends, and expand influence. The Parthenon itself, some argue, was built with money meant for defense. And yet the accounts, once painstakingly carved in stone, grow inconsistent as Athens' fortunes declined. The Peloponnesian War bled the city of men, ships, and silver. After Sparta's victory in 404 BC, Athens was humbled, but not entirely destroyed. Some wealth remained. In later decades, democratic governments reasserted themselves. Naval production resumed, but records of tribute, surplus, and the Navy's vast resources become spotty, then disappear altogether. No inventory, no final tally, only silence. What could have happened to it? Mainstream explanations suggest a slow and irreversible bleed. Wars, corruption, and inflation gradually siphoned away what remained of the Delian League's once glittering coffers. With Persia's influence returning and Sparta briefly dominant, Athens lost many of its tributary allies. The flow of silver slowed, then stopped. Maintenance of the triremes, expensive even in stable times, became unsustainable. but this alone does not account for the abruptness with which the financial trail vanishes. By the time Alexander the Great launched his campaign eastward in 334 BC, Athens was a shadow of its former naval glory. Some warships remained, but the massive fleet that once ruled the waves and the vaults that funded it had vanished. Did the silver simply dissipate, or was it moved? Some scholars have pointed to the hidden chambers beneath the Acropolis. Inscriptions and fragments mention subterranean storage rooms, possibly hewn into the bedrock beneath the temples. Were these vaults emptied during political turmoil? Could unscrupulous politicians or foreign agents have removed the wealth under the cover of war? One compelling clue comes from the records of the 4th century BC, when Athens was struggling to pay for its defenses. Officials began melting down religious statues and recoining sacred offerings to fund the fleet. This desperate act implies that other sources of wealth, such as the Navy's original treasury, were no longer available. Where had they gone? More speculative theories have emerged in recent decades. Some believe the wealth was intentionally hidden. As Macedonian power grew, Athenian loyalists may have stashed silver and gold reserves in remote sanctuaries or secret locations, perhaps even on Delos itself, or in mountain fortresses across Attica. There are stories, uncorroborated, of unexplored cave systems beneath Mount Pentelicus, once the source of Athens' famed marble. Could caches of war funds still lie hidden in the dark? Others draw connections to ancient piracy. The Aegean was never fully secure, even under Athenian control. Could rogue admirals or exiled commanders have redirected tribute ships to unknown harbors, keeping the treasure for themselves? Naval deserters during the Peloponnesian War are known to have turned pirate. And in an age where cargo manifests were written by hand and sealed in wax, theft could occur quietly, deliberately, and be erased from history. Even more fringe voices suggest the involvement of mystery cults. The Eleusinian Mysteries, centered just outside Athens, were deeply entwined with the city's religious and political elite. Initiates swore secrecy under threat of death. Some later accounts imply that the cult's inner circle held influence over public funds. Is it possible that wealth was redirected to spiritual ends, funneled into underground temples, or used to maintain rites far from the public eye? Though these theories are debated, they point to one undeniable truth: wealth leaves traces. And in the case of the Athenian navy, the trail ends far too soon. Today, archaeologists still study the stones of the Pnyx, the port of Piraeus, and the broken foundations of Delos. Inscriptions are reconstructed, shipping records examined, ancient ledgers painstakingly retranslated. Yet the answer remains elusive. How does a treasury, recorded in hundreds of talents of silver, simply vanish? Was it spent, or concealed, stolen, or sanctified? Or is it possible that we're still looking in the wrong places, expecting the wealth to be in coin, when perhaps it was transformed into something else altogether? And so we ask, what if the wealth of the Athenian navy, its true power, was never just material? What if, somewhere in the folds of time and marble, a deeper secret remains buried, one waiting not to be spent, but to be understood? For nearly 2,000 years, the ancient Greeks held ceremonies so secretive, so carefully guarded, that to speak of them outside their sanctuaries was to invite death. Known collectively as the mystery cults, these sacred rites were not public festivals, but private initiations into realms of the divine, rituals that promised wisdom, transformation, and perhaps even salvation. The most famous of these were the Eleusinian Mysteries, devoted to Demeter and Persephone. But across the Greek world, from Samothrace to Delphi to the slopes of Mount Parnassus, similar cults flourished in the shadows of official religion. What is less often discussed, what lies buried between lines of ancient texts and the silences of stone, is the striking role women played within them. In a society where public life was dominated by men, where women were excluded from the political assembly and barred from most forms of civic authority, why were they so deeply embedded, sometimes even central, in the operations of these sacred mysteries? Who were these women? What did they know? And what were they sworn to protect? The mystery begins in Eleusis. Just outside Athens, nestled between hills and fertile fields, Eleusis was sacred to the goddess Demeter, goddess of agriculture, sustenance, and the eternal cycles of life and death. Here, for centuries, pilgrims gathered annually in secret, passing through purification rituals, nighttime processions, and climactic ceremonies held in the great Telesterion. We know that women not only participated in these rites, they officiated them. The high priestess of Demeter, one of the most prestigious religious roles in all of Greece, was always a woman. She held authority over temple proceedings, supervised the sacred grain offerings, and may have presided over key elements of the initiation itself. In a world where female voices were often confined to domestic spaces, her voice echoed within stone sanctuaries and sacred groves. Why? Could it be that the mystery cults, unlike the civic religion of the polis, reflected older, deeper spiritual traditions, ones rooted in the rhythms of nature, birth, fertility, and death? Or was their inclusion a form of protected transgression, a space outside society's norms where different rules applied? Consider the tale at the heart of Eleusis, the abduction of Persephone, the descent into the underworld, and the grief-stricken wanderings of her mother, Demeter. This myth is not just a story, it is a ritual drama, one reenacted through the mysteries in stages both symbolic and emotional. The descent, the search, the return, these mirrored not only the agricultural seasons but also a deeper spiritual cycle, death and rebirth, separation and reunion. In this sacred narrative, women are not passive observers. They are the protagonists. The myth belongs to them. And perhaps so did the hidden knowledge it guarded. We do not know exactly what was said or done inside the Telesterion. The initiates were forbidden to reveal its secrets, and remarkably, they kept that silence. Not a single detailed account survives. But we do know that women were there, not as guests, but as keepers of the flame. Far from Eleusis, on the remote and windswept island of Samothrace, another mystery cult thrived, the Kabiri Mysteries. Here, initiates sought protection at sea and blessings of fertility, guided by cryptic rituals performed in subterranean chambers. Again, women played a central role. Archaeological evidence suggests that priestesses led portions of the ceremonies, possibly involving symbolic marriage rites or chthonic invocations. The exact identities of the deities remain obscure, called only the great gods, but their power was deeply felt. Even Alexander the Great is said to have been initiated here, possibly influenced by his mother, Olympias, who herself belonged to yet another mystery cult, the Dionysian rites of Orphic tradition. The Orphic Mysteries, named for the legendary poet and prophet Orpheus, present yet another thread in this woven tapestry. With their emphasis on the soul's journey after death, the Orphics offered teachings that diverged from traditional Greek thought. They spoke of reincarnation, purification, and the soul's yearning to return to the divine. Here, too, women appear, enigmatic, often veiled in allegory. Some scholars point to the so-called Orphic gold tablets buried with the dead, containing ritual instructions and cryptic verses. A number of these tablets refer to the initiate as a daughter of earth and starry heaven, suggesting a feminine voice preserved in funerary script. Were these fragments mere poetic convention, or whispered echoes of a theology shaped by women? Despite the evidence, we are left with haunting gaps. The names of many priestesses remain unrecorded. Their teachings, if ever written down, have vanished. What survives is filtered through the writings of male philosophers and historians, some of whom viewed the cults with suspicion or awe. Even so, tantalizing clues emerge. At Delphi, where the Oracle of Apollo gave prophecy to kings and commoners alike, the Pythia, the priestess who entered trance, was always a woman. Sitting atop a tripod, inhaling vapors rising from the earth, she spoke with a voice believed to be divine. Her answers shaped wars, founded colonies, and toppled empires. Is this another echo of a forgotten lineage? A vestige of an earlier, matrifocal spirituality? Or merely a sacred anomaly in a patriarchal world? Modern scholars continue to debate the origins and meanings of the mystery cults. Were they inherited from pre-Hellenic civilizations? Linked to Minoan priestess traditions? Were they influenced by contact with ancient Egypt or the spiritual practices of Phoenicia and Palestine? Some fringe theories even suggest that the mysteries preserved a wisdom tradition that predated the written word, an oral lineage passed through generations of female initiates, encoded in gesture, dance, and symbol. We cannot say. But we do know this. Within these silent temples, among the stone ruins of Eleusis, Samothrace, and beyond, women once held sacred power. They spoke to the gods. They guided initiates through darkness into light, and they did so in ways that remain shrouded in mystery. What knowledge did they carry? What truths were entrusted to their care? And why, after thousands of years, do their voices still feel so close, yet so impossibly out of reach? Perhaps the silence is not an absence, but an invitation to listen more closely, to feel the faint tremble of forgotten prayers in the wind, and to wonder what still lies buried in the sacred stones beneath our feet. Beneath the triumphal myths of Spartan glory, beneath the legends of discipline, courage, and conquest, lies a question that refuses to fade. What happened to the Helots? These were not invaders, nor slaves brought from distant shores. The Helots were the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, the native populations subjugated by Sparta during its rise to power. For centuries, they tilled the fields, harvested the crops, and served the Spartan elite in enforced servitude. Their labor supported the entire militarized machine of the Spartan state. And yet, by the twilight of the classical era, they vanish. How can a population so vast, so essential, simply disappear from the historical record? The answers are elusive, and the silence unsettling. Herodotus tells us that the Helots were treated harshly, humiliated with symbolic dress, and subjected to random executions. Thucydides describes their rebellions, most notably during the massive earthquake of 464 BC, when thousands of Helots seized the moment to rise against their Spartan overlords. But it is in the writings of later historians, like Plutarch, that we find the most chilling glimpses into this dark chapter of Greek history. According to Plutarch, young Spartans were sometimes encouraged to kill Helots as part of their training, a rite of passage in the infamous cryptia. Under cover of night, they would slip into the countryside and eliminate those deemed threats to the state. This organized terror, whether exaggerated or not, underscores the deep anxiety Spartans felt toward their enslaved population. But again, how many were they? And where did they go? Some ancient sources suggest that Helots numbered as many as 7 for every Spartan citizen. If this was even remotely accurate, they should have outlasted Sparta's fall. They should have left traces, villages, lineages, artifacts. Yet no Helot settlements have been conclusively identified. No Helot language survives, and even their very name disappears from records after the Hellenistic period. Were they absorbed? Were they erased? Some scholars argue that over time, Helots may have been gradually assimilated into other social classes. Freed during wars, perhaps, or relocated into peripheral communities. Others suggest that during the chaos of the Peloponnesian War and the eventual collapse of Spartan dominance, entire populations of Helots may have fled or been destroyed. But these are theories, not certainties. And then there are the stranger suggestions, ideas not found in textbooks, but whispered in the shadows of speculative history. One theory posits that the Helots, faced with centuries of oppression, may have formed clandestine networks, hidden religious groups, rural sanctuaries, or even fugitive societies in the highlands beyond Sparta's reach. Over generations, they could have retreated into the rugged terrain of the Peloponnesus, shedding their name, their identity, and their history in the process. Could some of the isolated mountain villages that dotted southern Greece long after the classical era be the descendants of Helot refugees? Oral traditions in some remote regions speak of ancestral displacement and ancient migrations. Yet linking these stories directly to Helots remains an act of conjecture. Another theory looks beyond Greece entirely. Some speculate that following their liberation or expulsion, segments of the Helot population may have migrated, blending into the vast currents of displaced peoples during the chaotic 4th century BC. Could they have joined mercenary armies or followed trade routes across the Aegean, perhaps even settling in distant lands under new names, new tongues? And then there's the enigma of silence itself. In ancient times, conquest was often followed by the obliteration of identity. We know of peoples erased from history not by disappearance, but by design. Their gods forgotten, their customs overwritten, their names replaced by the languages of the victors. Could the Helots have suffered such a fate? Or, more disturbingly, could their story have been buried deliberately? Sparta's obsession with order and control extended beyond the battlefield. Information was guarded, speech was regulated. Even in death, Spartans were remembered with stark anonymity. No grave markers for most, no personal records. Could the Helots, so thoroughly controlled in life, have also been denied memory in death? Were they simply not allowed to be remembered? As we walk among the scattered ruins of Sparta today, little speaks to the lives of the Helots. No temples bear their names. No tombs have been found that clearly belong to them. Their voices are absent from the literature, their perspective never recorded. And yet, they were there. They were the backbone of an entire society. They must have loved, mourned, sung, hoped. Somewhere, in the soil beneath our feet, the truth may still lie waiting. Perhaps in an undiscovered grave, or an inscription misinterpreted, or in a faint, stubborn whisper in the dialect of a mountain village that no longer remembers where it came from. Could it be that the greatest mystery of Sparta is not its warriors, but those who supported them? What really became of the Helots? Were they freed and forgotten, scattered to the winds, or quietly, systematically erased, so thoroughly that only their absence remains? In the empty fields where they once labored, the question lingers like morning mist. And in that stillness, we are left to wonder, not just what happened to the Helots, but how many other forgotten peoples wait in silence, their histories hidden beneath layers of conquest, omission, and time. In this forgotten outpost of the ancient Greek world, in the early 5th century BC, a man named Parmenides wrote a single poem. A poem so strange, so uncompromising, that it still echoes in the halls of philosophical inquiry today, though faintly and with much of it lost. Parmenides of Elea is often called the father of metaphysics, yet the survival of his teachings is a paradox in itself. For a figure so foundational, his legacy is curiously incomplete. His work, on nature, survives only in fragments. Quotes embedded within the writings of others, copied and recopied across centuries. Who was this man who dared to say that all change is an illusion? That the world we see is a lie? And why did his voice, once so influential, nearly vanish? Parmenides taught that reality is singular, unchanging, and eternal. "What is, he wrote, "and what is not, a deceptively simple formula with profound consequences. For him, the senses deceive. Motion, time, plurality, all illusions of a confused human mind. Truth, he argued, could only be reached through reason, not perception." In the age of Heraclitus and the Ionian naturalists, who saw the world as flux, as fire, as flowing rivers, Parmenides offered a radical negation. He wasn't just proposing a new theory of nature, he was proposing that all prior understandings of existence were fundamentally flawed. And yet, after Parmenides, the voice of the Eleatic school seems to dim. His pupil, Zeno, is remembered largely for his paradoxes, which famously challenge the notion of motion and plurality. But even Zeno fades from prominence. Melissus, another Eleatic, is mentioned occasionally in later texts, but with little reverence. Meanwhile, other philosophical schools begin to rise: the Atomists, the Sophists, the Platonists. Plato admired Parmenides, but only partially. Aristotle, who would shape centuries of thought, treated Parmenides' strict logic as a curiosity to be worked around, not a foundation to be embraced. How did the teachings of a man once regarded as a giant, perhaps the very cornerstone of metaphysical thought, become a philosophical footnote? Part of the answer may lie in the nature of his work itself. Parmenides expressed his philosophy not in treatises or dialogues, but in verse, a mysterious hexameter poem that begins with a symbolic journey, a chariot ride through the gates of night and day into the presence of a goddess who reveals the truth. This is not the language of scientific analysis. It is the language of initiation. Was Parmenides merely using poetic imagery? Or was his philosophy rooted in a deeper, more esoteric tradition? Some scholars suggest that On Nature was not just a philosophical argument. It was a ritual text. Its opening may mirror elements of Orphic or Pythagorean initiation, the journey from darkness to light, the revelation from a divine feminine source. Could Parmenides have been a mystic cloaked in the garments of a logician? And if so, who were his intended students? The town of Elea, where he lived, was a Greek colony in Magna Graecia, a region of southern Italy that was home to many esoteric thinkers. Pythagoras had founded his school nearby. Mystery cults flourished. The air was thick with spiritual experimentation, cross-cultural fusion, and philosophical ambition. Some modern researchers have even speculated that Parmenides may have been associated with early forms of Eastern philosophy, possibly influenced through Mediterranean trade routes, Phoenician contact, or even pre-Hellenic traditions rooted in Egypt or Palestine. Though unprovable, such theories open the door to wider questions. Was Parmenides articulating a universal truth glimpsed also in non-Greek systems, such as the Upanishads or Buddhist conceptions of illusion? Or was he a singular Greek mind standing against the tide? The greater mystery, however, lies in what came after. By the time of the Hellenistic period, Parmenides' teachings had become background noise to more practical or ethical philosophies: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Aristotelian logic. Later, Neoplatonists would reinterpret his ideas through the lens of divine unity, but these were more echoes than resurrections. No new Eleatic school emerged. No tradition carried his torch. No community of disciples left behind libraries or temples or manifestos. Could it be that the severity of his thought, the uncompromising denial of the senses, the challenge to multiplicity, was too stark, too isolating? A worldview with no room for gods, motion, time, or individual identity may have felt cold, even terrifying, to ancient minds. Or was it actively suppressed? There are faint rumors, whispers from fringe circles, that Parmenides' full poem once included teachings too controversial to survive. That later philosophers, aligned with political or religious institutions, may have chosen to preserve only those parts that could be digested and absorbed. The goddess in his poem, for example, speaks in riddles. Could she have conveyed more than logic? Hidden codes, perhaps, or cosmologies incompatible with later dogmas? Others believe the original text may have been destroyed during library purges, as Alexandria burned, as scrolls vanished in the chaos of empire and conversion. Could Parmenides' unfiltered vision have slipped quietly into oblivion? Even today, new fragments continue to surface, in papyri, in ancient commentaries, in disputed attributions. But the whole remains elusive, as though we are peering through a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting only a piece of a long-lost truth. So we are left to wonder, why does the legacy of Parmenides feel more like an echo than a presence? Was he too far ahead of his time, or outside of it entirely? Did his vision die with him, or has it merely gone underground, waiting to be rediscovered? In the shadowed stones of Elea, where his footsteps once fell, the waves still crash against the cliffs. The wind carries no answer. But somewhere in the silence, the question persists. What happened to the teachings of the man who declared that only being truly is? And if we could recover them in full, would we dare to understand? Beneath the surface of the Aegean, in harbors and coves, at the mouths of ancient rivers and along now forgotten trade routes, lies one of the greatest silent mysteries of the ancient world. Where did the bronze statues of ancient Greece go? Greece was once a land of living metal. Its cities and sanctuaries, temples and public squares, were alive with the gleam of sculpted bronze. Kings, gods, athletes, heroes, all cast in flowing muscular form, frozen mid-stride, mid-battle, mid-thought. The ancient writers spoke of hundreds, even thousands of such works. Pausanias, the 2nd century Greek traveler and geographer, described entire sanctuaries shimmering with bronze statues. At Olympia, he saw dedications by victors, offerings from cities and monuments to gods, many in bronze, towering and lifelike. And yet today, only a handful remain. Not dozens, not even a full dozen, just a few. Among them are the haunting Rhyaeus warriors, 2 larger-than-life bronze statues of bearded nude warriors discovered by accident in 1972 off the coast of Calabria, southern Italy. Pulled from the seabed by a recreational diver, these statues, cast in the 5th century BC, are breathtaking in their realism and power. Every detail, from the veins on their hands to the curls in their beards, radiates life. They are a rare glimpse into a lost world, because nearly all other large bronze statues from ancient Greece are gone. What happened to them? The mainstream explanation is straightforward, almost disarmingly so. Bronze, unlike marble, can be melted down and reused, and so, during the Roman Empire, and especially during its decline, many statues were stripped from sanctuaries, cities, and temples. They were not destroyed out of hatred for Greek culture, but out of practicality. In times of scarcity and war, bronze was needed for coins, weapons, and tools. Even artistic appreciation could not stand against the hunger for metal. But this practical narrative leaves gaps, mysteries that seem to deepen the longer we look. Why were some statues left behind? Why do a few, like the Delphic charioteer or the Artemisian Zeus, survive, while so many others vanished utterly? And what of those statues we know existed, described in loving detail by ancient authors, but which have simply disappeared without even fragments remaining? Consider the Colossus of Rhodes. Built in the early 3rd century BC, this massive bronze statue of the sun god Helios is said to have stood over 30 meters tall, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to later accounts, an earthquake toppled it, and the remains lay in ruins for centuries before being allegedly sold off and carted away by merchants from the east. But no physical trace has ever been confirmed. No fragment of metal, no bronze toe, no definitive sculptural piece. Did it truly exist as described? Or has the legend grown in the telling? Then there's the statue of Athena Promachos, a towering bronze figure by the sculptor Phidias, which stood on the Acropolis and was visible from ships approaching Athens. Ancient sources confirm its existence. Its presence is not debated, and yet, where is it now? No known copy survives. No definitive chunk of it has been found. Some believe these statues were lost to looting, carried off during invasions, sold and smelted in distant lands. Others suggest they were intentionally hidden, buried by worshippers during periods of iconoclasm or political upheaval. After all, the shift to Christianity in the Roman world brought waves of religious reform. Pagan temples were closed. Statues deemed idolatrous were destroyed, or perhaps hidden in hopes of later recovery. Were some of these bronzes buried beneath sanctuaries, concealed in coastal caves, tossed into the sea not as trash, but as sacred offerings to Poseidon or other deities, their weight intended to keep them safe from human hands? The sea, it seems, is where many of these statues meet their mysterious end. In recent decades, marine archaeologists have uncovered several bronze masterpieces not in temples or ruins, but deep beneath the water. The Artemisian bronze, thought to depict either Zeus or Poseidon, was discovered off the coast of Euboea in the 1920s, tangled in nets. The Antikythera youth, found near the famed Antikythera shipwreck, emerged from the sea's grip after centuries of silence. Each discovery raises more questions than answers. Why were these statues being transported by ship? Were they war spoils, merchant goods, religious icons on their way to distant lands? And why did so many end up at the bottom of the sea? Could it be that somewhere, still hidden in underwater ravines or coastal silt, lie the remains of Greece's lost bronze pantheon, waiting to be discovered? Speculative theories, of course, abound. Some believe that secret hoards still exist, sealed vaults in the mountains of Crete, or in submerged cities off the coast of modern-day Libya. Rumors persist of private collectors who may have acquired pieces through illicit excavation, hoarding ancient bronzes in hidden galleries. Others point to the sheer improbability of survival, that statues made from a material so coveted, so reusable, could only last through extreme luck or obscurity. But still, what if a major cache remains? What if, beneath the sands of forgotten harbors, lie dozens of statues, uncorroded, intact, preserved in darkness? What if the sea, which once swallowed them, becomes the key to revealing them again? Today, with advancements in underwater scanning and archaeological robotics, new expeditions continue to probe the Mediterranean depths. Each year brings whispers of new finds. A foot here, a fragment of armature there, glimpses of artistry thought extinct. And always the question persists: how many more bronze masterpieces lie out there, unknown and unseen? How many silent gods of the ancient world remain entombed beneath the waves, watching, waiting, forgotten, until they rise once more into the light? There is a silence that hangs over the highlands of eastern Anatolia, a silence unbroken for millennia, disturbed only by the whisper of wind across ancient stone. It was through this desolate landscape around 401 BC that an army marched, a force of nearly 10,000 seasoned Greek mercenaries, veterans of battle, disciplined, resolute, united by contract and cause. And then, as quickly as they appeared in the historical record, they were gone. What happened to the 10,000? The story begins with promise and peril. The 10,000 were hired by Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince with ambitions to seize the throne from his brother Artaxerxes II. These mercenaries were drawn from across the Greek world: Spartans, Athenians, Arcadians, lured by gold, adventure, or simple desperation. They joined Cyrus's grand campaign deep into the heart of the Persian Empire, a march that would end in betrayal and blood at the Battle of Cunaxa, near modern-day Baghdad. Cyrus fell in battle, and with his death, the Greeks, foreigners in a hostile empire, became fugitives. From there, the tale becomes one of history's most remarkable survival stories, or so we're told. According to Xenophon, a soldier and historian who marched with the 10,000 and later chronicled their journey in his Anabasis, the mercenaries fought their way north through enemy territory. Facing Persian armies, harsh terrain, and internal divisions, they eventually reached the Black Sea. Upon seeing the water, they shouted in joy, "Thalata! Thalata! The sea! The sea!" It was, as Xenophon described it, a triumphant escape, a testament to Greek discipline and determination. His account, vivid and detailed, has shaped our understanding of the expedition for over 2 millennia. And yet, not all is as clear as it seems. For while Xenophon's Anabasis paints a stirring narrative, the historical record beyond his own words is strangely empty. Independent sources verifying the fate of the 10,000 are few and vague. Later Greek writers refer to the expedition in passing, but often draw their knowledge from Xenophon himself. No Persian records survive to confirm the events as described. No physical traces, no mass graves, no large-scale camps, no military artifacts have ever been conclusively tied to their journey across Anatolia. Is it possible that Xenophon exaggerated their numbers or embellished their route? Or is it possible that not all the 10,000 made it to the sea? Historians note that Xenophon's figures are suspiciously round, 10,000 at the outset, roughly the same number at the end. Yet he also describes heavy casualties, skirmishes, ambushes, disease, desertions. The math doesn't add up. Some believe the 10,000 may have split, with only a portion reaching the Black Sea while others disappeared into the wilderness. Others suggest that desertion and infighting fragmented the army long before Xenophon's triumphant conclusion. If so, where did the rest go? Could some have been captured or defected, assimilating into the very Persian society they were meant to fight? More curious still are local Anatolian legends, fragments of oral histories and place names that speak of ghost soldiers or bronze men who once passed through the hills and never returned. In remote parts of modern-day eastern Turkey, there are ruins that don't match local architecture, walls built in styles more Hellenic than native, standing far from known Greek colonies. Could these be the remains of temporary encampments? Or perhaps settlements founded by Greek soldiers who chose not to continue the long road home? There is even a speculative theory that some members of the 10,000 joined local communities, taking on new identities and leaving the battlefield behind. In these isolated pockets of Anatolia, where ancient dialects and customs persisted for centuries, could fragments of a lost Greek military culture have survived in secrecy? And then there's the strangest thread of all. A fringe theory, largely dismissed by mainstream historians, suggests that Xenophon's Anabasis was not just a military chronicle, but a carefully constructed allegory, a philosophical journey masked as a historical account. According to this view, the 10,000 were never meant to be understood as a literal army, but as symbolic seekers of truth, wandering through a foreign land of moral chaos in search of reason and virtue, hallmarks of Greek identity. Supporters of this view point to the highly stylized language, the moral lessons woven through the text, and the recurring themes of leadership, justice, and the soul's perseverance. Could Xenophon have blurred fact and fiction, myth and memory, to craft a story that inspired future generations of Greeks? Not by recounting what truly happened, but by imagining what should have happened. If so, what happened to the real 10,000? The ancient world had little incentive to preserve the truth if the legend served a greater purpose. And for the Greeks, the story of the 10,000 was not merely one of military survival, it was proof that Hellenic courage, even deep in a hostile land, could overcome chaos and betrayal. But behind the legend, the facts remain elusive. Were there really 10,000? Did they all survive? Were some absorbed into the cultures they traversed? Did they found villages, marry into tribes, trade their spears for plows? Or were they silenced, one by one, hill by hill, until their numbers dwindled into myth? Today, the route of the 10,000 is still debated by archaeologists and historians alike. New technologies, like satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, may someday uncover evidence of their path: a burial site, a weapon cache, a coin minted far from home. But until then, we are left with questions. What became of the warriors who followed Cyrus into the heart of an empire? What stories remain buried in the hills of Anatolia, waiting for the wind to stir them into memory? And when we speak of the 10,000, are we honoring real men? Or walking through the echo of an idea that once inspired a civilization? The silence of the highlands keeps its answer. Among the crumbled remnants of the ancient world, few places pulse with lingering enigma quite like Delphi. Once the heart of Greek spirituality, it drew kings, generals, philosophers, and commoners alike, each hoping to glimpse the will of the gods. Here, at the foot of Mount Parnassus, the Oracle of Apollo once murmured in riddles, her voice carried through the smoke of laurel and the faint tremors of the earth. But it was not only prophecy that echoed from these stones. Inscribed above the entrance to the temple, 3 short commands greeted all who came. Know thyself. Nothing in excess. And finally, the curious, surety brings ruin. These were not idle phrases. They were among what came to be known as the Delphic Maxims, a collection of concise moral imperatives, once said to number 147. And despite their seeming simplicity, they guard a mystery that has outlived the oracle herself. What was the true purpose of the Delphic Maxims? The Maxims were attributed to the 7 sages of Greece, semi-legendary statesmen and philosophers from the 6th century BC. Men like Solon of Athens, Thales of Miletus, and Chilon of Sparta. Each sage supposedly contributed to this list of wisdom, carved into stone and displayed within the sacred precinct of Delphi. Yet, the list is curious. Many of the sayings are startlingly short. Control your anger. Honor your ancestors. Do not speak evil of the dead. Some sound like moral instructions. Others feel cryptic, even contradictory. And unlike the sprawling works of Plato or Aristotle, these maxims remain terse, almost coded. Were they simple reminders for ethical living, or something far more calculated? According to some classical authors, the maxims served as a kind of moral compass for citizens of the Greek world, guiding behavior, shaping public discourse, and reinforcing the communal values of the polis. In this interpretation, they were educational tools, ancient aphorisms designed to instill self-restraint, humility, and harmony. But other scholars point to the context of their placement. They weren't displayed in schools or etched into the walls of homes. They stood at the entrance of a temple, the Temple of Apollo, god of prophecy, light, and knowledge. The very same temple where the oracle issued cryptic answers from deep within the earth. Why place these particular sayings here, at the threshold between mortal questions and divine answers? Could the maxims have been more than just moral suggestions? In some traditions, they were viewed as keys, preparation for understanding the riddles of the oracle herself. Know thyself, after all, is not just a call to self-awareness. It is an invitation to look inward before seeking outward answers. A warning that without understanding your own soul, you might misinterpret the signs of the gods. Consider this. Pilgrims from across the ancient world made the arduous journey to Delphi not to receive lectures, but to ask questions. Questions about fate, justice, war, and the unknown. Before passing through the sacred gate, they encountered these short inscriptions. Were they challenges? Filters? Tests? Others have noticed a more esoteric pattern. In the last century, philosophers and symbolists have analyzed the full list of 147 maxims as a kind of coded system, a proto-cosmology hidden in plain sight. Some point to the number itself. 147, a number that, when broken down in specific numerical systems used by the Pythagoreans, reveals sequences linked to harmony, proportion, and cosmic order. Could the maxims have been more than moral sayings? Perhaps a map of human behavior aligned with the balance of the universe? It sounds far-fetched. And yet the Pythagoreans, who held Delphi in deep reverence, believed numbers were the true language of the cosmos. To them, music, geometry, ethics, and even the soul were governed by number and ratio. Did they see the maxims as a kind of sacred geometry of virtue? Still more curious is the way the maxims have survived. Although the oracle's voice fell silent with the rise of Christianity and the decline of pagan temples, the maxims continued to be copied, by hand, by monks, and eventually in printed collections. They were preserved not only in Greece, but in manuscripts stretching from Byzantium to the Arab world. Why would such brief, cryptic sayings endure while so many other texts were lost? And why were they revered across philosophical schools so different in nature? Stoics, Neoplatonists, Cynics, even early Christian thinkers. It is as if the maxims transcended religion, culture, and ideology, suggesting that their meaning reached deeper than any one belief system. There is also the question of authorship. While tradition assigns the maxims to the seven sages, modern scholars doubt that such a neat origin story holds true. Some of the sayings reflect Dorian values. Others are clearly Ionian. Some mirror Spartan austerity, others Athenian wit. Were they truly the work of wise men? Or, as one theory suggests, were they the collected utterances of the oracle herself, fragments of prophetic speech, later distilled and reinterpreted by priests and philosophers alike? And if that were true, could the maxims contain encrypted messages, ancient truths obscured by time and translation? Today, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi lies in ruins, but the maxims remain. They continue to be studied, quoted, reinterpreted, like echoes from a forgotten code, still whispering through the stones of Parnassus. For all our knowledge, their true origin and purpose elude us. Were they lessons, warnings, spiritual formulas, or were they placed at the gateway to something greater, not to explain, but to prepare? And if so, what might they still be preparing us for? The answers, if they exist, remain as elusive as the oracle's breath.